Chapter 5. Judged by the Judges. I have found it extremely difficult to converse with whites who bitterly oppose what they call quotas, reverse discrimination, and preferential treatment. They can be expected to begin each statement by announcing that they are not opposed to anti-discrimination laws to prevent future deprivations based on racial prejudice. But they seem unable to understand that the past remains with us, prejudice and bias must still be fought, and that the law needs to lead the way in preventing those who might discriminate from doing so. Many whites do not believe legislative atonement in the present is necessary to rule out the racist abominations that have haunted America like a vindictive ghost. The only problem with this guilt rationale is that very little may be said to be quote-unquote past. The past is the present, and so far as any analyst of emotional defects can detect, it will remain so as long as white eyes can perceive a darker skin color and find in that difference some comfort of superiority. The historical comfort of the illusion inspires the racial animus and makes it seem both necessary and proper. It is as though the opening words of T.S. Eliot's Burnt Norton have been made the religion of race in America. For, quote, time present and time past are both, perhaps, present in time future, and time future contained in the past, end quote. As Daniel Patrick Moynihan put it before he succumbed to the cant of his political ambitions, whites have castrated blacks for so long that they need not do it anymore because the blacks now do it themselves. Now and then blacks yield to an instinctive impulse to fight back. Sometimes they pick the wrong target. That urge was brought home forcefully to me during an incident early in my career on the bench. I had been told that I should use every free moment unobtrusively to enter the courtrooms of older judges and learn by observing how to conduct the affairs of criminal justice. This I did with some astonishing results. One day in the Bronx, I saw 8 Hispanics brought from the detention pens to be charged and arraigned. With them was one lone black, and it was he upon whom the courtroom attention was fixed, because he repeated in a shrill and incredulous voice, "I don't shoot no craps with no spics." He was heedless of the decorum and dignified quiet that is supposed to attend proceedings in a court of law. He was shaking his head from side to side, repeating the same phrase. He continued his plaint while all the defendants stood before the bench. The presiding judge said to the man's public defender lawyer, "Counsel, will you please direct your client not to talk?" His lawyer cautioned him to say nothing. The other defendants looked at him as though they regarded him as insane. They said nothing, and a Spanish interpreter apparently did not explain the unhappy repetitions. Cautioned again to remain silent, the black became angrier, and with even greater emphasis he insisted, "But I don't shoot craps with no spics." The judge, showing his first sign of impatience, said to the man's lawyer, "Counselor, please tell your client what my name is." Before he could do so, the black defendant said, "All I was doing was walking along the block trying to pass these spics shooting craps on the sidewalk when all these cops jumped out of cars and rounded up all of us. But I know I don't shoot no craps with spics." His lawyer then said to the defendant, "That's Judge Gomez." The defendant immediately exclaimed, "Oh shit, another spic." Judge Gomez, with a half smile and shaking his head as though bewildered, said, "Dismissed, dismissed. Get him out of here." The defendant left, still muttering his personal code about his choice of dicing companions, as though it was an inflexible ethic. In a sense, the dismissal was an example of a beneficial discrimination, a competition of discriminations, or perhaps a discriminatory benefit for the black defendant. It left me with the melancholy impression that I had just witnessed, in microcosm, the war between New York City's two principal ethnic minorities. There is another phase to that informal and official undeclared war, which has spread into the state prisons and municipal jails as well. The conflict between the blacks and Puerto Ricans has been fed and induced for many years by the police department. The lightest skinned black arrested, if he has an English name, is always described as either black or Negro. From my first trial on, I was constantly amazed to notice that on the forms prepared by the arresting officers, Hispanics were invariably described as white, no matter what their obvious pigmentation might be. I wearied of that senseless game early in my career. I perceived, in its blindness to reality, a police conspiracy, inadvertent or otherwise, to keep the blacks and Puerto Ricans divided by reinforcing distance and hostility between them. The result was the destruction of any possible unity between the two principal minorities and poor of the city. It seemed sad that neither group appeared to recognize that both were caught in the same ethnic trap, and that discrimination against them differed, if at all, only in nuance. Unfortunately, it appeared that the Hispanics, having been described as white, had come to believe that forlorn fiction. Whether a conspiracy or not, the practice of designating Hispanics as white was succeeding as an element of divisiveness. It was the old colonial device of divide and rule by keeping New York's blacks and Hispanics at odds. The police, acting as tools of a class their employment would never permit them to join, were perpetuating a class system within a class system. The equality of poverty was being divided into the scorned and the more scorned, even among themselves. It reminds me of the American Colonization Society, which was organized in 1817 to establish a colony in Africa to which formerly imported Negroes in America could be exported. The society represented white fear of the black population, expressed by Thomas Jefferson, that one day the Negroes would rise up to redress the grievances of slavery. In the 20th century, the notion of exporting the dark menace has been replaced by internal methods of division and containment. The political triumphs of blacks in major cities such as Atlanta and New Orleans symbolize the power of black unity. If the blacks and Hispanics were ever to compromise their differences and vote for a common purpose, they easily could win the mayor's office and many others. The police remain the agents of ethnic division in New York City, even though ironically most of them seem to be non-residents. The underlying act of dividing the black and Puerto Rican communities continues in a different form, for now it appears that blacks with Spanish surnames are referred to as Hispanics, and only occasionally as whites. There must be relatively few charges of racism brought against white judges at official disciplinary proceedings. I would assume that white judges would consider a charge of racism a minor accusation. A black judge so charged might find his situation more precarious. One night, as I sat in the newly established Bronx Criminal Court, a young district attorney named Martin Schwartz was on duty. He seemed tense, and the quick, darting movement of both his eyes and gestures, as well as his manner of speech, gave him a furtive appearance. During a break in the proceedings, he came to my robing room to talk. He told me that he had worked in Washington as a Treasury agent, investigating and discovering evidence for criminal prosecutions by the federal government. He was not happy in that role because he never did the prosecuting, and what he really wished to do was try cases. So he had resigned and joined the staff of the Bronx District Attorney, then Burton Roberts. In a moment of revelation, Schwartz touched on the District of Columbia's preventive detention ordinance for holding someone charged with a crime until the time of the trial. I asked if this was not President Nixon's idea of controlling the mostly black population of Washington by undermining the presumption of innocence. He ignored that question, but responded that every white person in America harbored some bias and prejudice against blacks, and that on the basis of what he had seen, he understood and felt some sympathy for the John Birch Society. I was astonished at this admission, but both of us were called back to duty before the subject could be further explored. Shortly after court resumed, a black man was arraigned before me. As I recall, he was charged with attempted murder and possession of a dangerous weapon. Separated from his wife and small child, he had gone to their former home to deliver alimony or child support. Because he was employed as a security guard, he carried a weapon. He surprised his wife, his lawyer said, in a flagrante delicto with another man, while his little daughter was in the same room. His fury ignited. He attempted to shoot at his wife's lover, who fled half-clad. The shot had missed. The man's lawyer, well known to me, vouched for his client's integrity, and both promised that, if released, the defendant would return to court on the set date. I said that he would be released on his given word. Schwartz became excited and angry, demanding bail of $25,000 as a condition of the defendant's pretrial release. I said the matter was concluded and that the next case should be presented. Schwartz, however, continued to press for the requested bail. The exchange became heated. I reminded Schwartz that he had confessed to me his own sense of bias and said I feared his demonstration to be proof of his own prejudice. He and a companion, Howard Finger, immediately complained to both the press and the Committee on Judiciary Relations. Schwartz summoned Burton Roberts himself. Roberts appeared and asked to speak to me in chambers. Roberts is a strange and flamboyant personality, best described as an unusual character. Neither he nor his peculiar characteristics were unknown to me. He had been a roommate of my tennis partner at Cornell Law School, and from time to time we met socially. I remembered his crestfallen appearance when he applied for employment at the firm of Proskauer, Rose, Getz, and Mendelsohn, where I was then working. The firm insisted that each associate bring with him or her the intellectual distinction of having been a law review editor. Roberts did not meet that standard. Rejected in his ambition, he wrote a lengthy and rambling letter, the main theme of which was that when he was where the bombs were falling during World War II, no one had required him to be a law review editor. Roberts had refined his personal vision of the imitation of life to reflect the image of what he believed a film version of District Attorney should be. His facial expressions varied from a skeptical squint to a cunning half-smile, as though he had just received a printout of an adversary's mind. Affecting his best Hollywood style, he insisted upon privacy with me. "Listen, Bruce," he said, "even if you're correct in dealing with Schwartz, and I doubt it, I would still have to protect my man." He then added a comment about my bail practices, saying, "That crap may be all right in Manhattan, but not up here." This was his way of confirming that the Bronx was his personal fiefdom, and that I was at best a licensed trespasser. He ignored my lecture to him about my determination not to tolerate any intrusion of racist bias in any court where I sat. Earlier in my career, when I had been general counsel to the Human Resources Administration of the City of New York, I had to appear at ceremonies celebrating the opening of community law offices. On one such occasion in the Bronx, Roberts and I were chatting backstage before being called upon to speak. Roberts was in rare and eloquent form as he damned the United States Supreme Court for its decisions under Chief Justice Warren, who, he said, adeptly using the current cliché, had handcuffed the police and prosecutors. In his actual address, Roberts launched into extravagant praise of the very court opinions he had just cursed. The subject of a 1969 New York Magazine article, he had been featured in a full-face photograph on the magazine's cover with a legend that portrayed him as the city's toughest DA. Inside, it was as though a coarse comedian had granted an interview by acting out some of his more censorable material. At one point, Roberts discussed blacks. He became a darky in whiteface, and his voice was transformed into minstrel intonations as he assured the author of the article that there was no trouble from the Schwartzes, 'cause they know they's gonna end up in the pokey. All of this was acted out with the flashing eyes and showing of teeth that Roberts attributed to blacks. The following week, a letter from a Mr. Fishman appeared in the magazine asking how anyone could have respect for the law when the highest law officer of the Bronx used the Yiddish term for niggers in referring to blacks. As though not to slight the Hispanics by omitting any mention of their status, he later commented to the press about a political dispute involving Puerto Ricans by suggesting that they were savages and the Bronx itself a jungle. Roberts appears to be restless as a state Supreme Court justice. All too often it seems that he has relinquished the title of district attorney, but not the role. Judges presiding at jury trials are supposed to be aloof from bias and take no sides. Indeed, a standard part of a judge's instructions to a jury is the admonition that the judge himself has no opinion about the case being tried, because that is the territorial imperative of the jury. Nevertheless, Roberts has been reversed several times in murder cases for intruding his views into a trial. In an October 1980 reversal of a jury verdict of guilty in a murder trial, the appellate division in Manhattan noticed that Mr. Justice Roberts had asked questions of a witness in such a way that his skepticism was revealed. This persuasive error, the court wrote, deprived the defendant of a fair trial. A new and expensive trial was ordered. In 1979, the manslaughter convictions of 2 defendants were reversed because Justice Roberts had asked 1,300 questions, more than 1/3 of all the questions posed during the trial. In a 1978 bribe-receiving trial, a federal court annulled the conviction of the defendant because he felt that the conduct of the trial judge, Roberts, would lead to his conviction in any event. And in another 1978 case in which manslaughter was charged, an appeals court reversed a conviction because, as it said, Roberts had unduly injected himself into the trial. Such injections are like adrenaline to Roberts. He will never be a truly happy public servant until he is once again a district attorney, possessed of a perfect right to demonstrate with flamboyance and flair what side he is on. The remarks he made to me concerning the Schwartz incident were no surprise. It would have been surprising had he been quietly analytical and understanding. For my scolding of Schwartz, I was summoned before a Judiciary Relations Committee, which had heard testimony in my absence to which I was never allowed access. Both Martin Schwartz and Howard Finger had given their versions of what had occurred. The committee members posed oblique questions, obviously in an effort to catch me up in some harmful inconsistency. The atmosphere was hostile. Everyone but I had a transcript of the official court minutes of my exchanges with Schwartz. Suddenly, though, it occurred to my learned inquisitors that it was perhaps awkward to press upon me questions related to an event that had occurred months earlier while they looked at an official record of the event and I had none. To the embarrassment of some of the committee members, it was moved that they go into executive session while I was allowed to read the transcript. It took only a few minutes after my testimony for the committee to dictate its findings, and censure me for my remarks on the record to Schwartz. The inference could be drawn that for similar but off-the-record remarks, there would have been prosecution. Earlier, I had attempted to get the very transcript that had been withheld from me, only to be told by the official court reporter that he had instructions not to prepare one for me. The infamous Star Chamber had served as a useful precedent for the judges to utter their opinion of me. Another interesting aspect of the committee's work is the presence among its members of Herbert B. Evans, who later became the state's chief administrative judge. His functions there did not seem entirely clear, except as the author of frequent memoranda transmitting the views of the chief judge of the Court of Appeals who had selected him. Evans, intellectually gifted and an ultra-conservative with a devotion to murky detail, had been one of my former law partners. He and I had never been close friends and had indeed been at odds for most of the time we practiced law in the same firm. In view of our past friction, I was mildly astonished that he insisted on sitting in judgment of me rather than withdrawing. It seemed natural that he would one day become, in effect, the state's controlling analyst of judicial ethics, because he ignored the caution urged upon all judges to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Not only did Evans persist in his committee membership, but he joined in the unanimous censure of me for my remarks to Schwartz. One other black judge had served on the committee, William Logwin, but he had so fully passed over into the white ranks that few blacks were aware that he was nominally one of them. In skin color, he was so fair as to deceive the American eye's usual eagerness to detect the single drop of black blood that marked one as a Negro. Logwin had been a long-time prosecutor before elevation to the bench, and he and I had only a nodding acquaintance. If the rumor is accurate that this man is related to the Reverend J.W. Logwin, an escaped slave, he is proof of the theory that genes of resistance can be diluted through the years by the token comforts of the system. Reverend Logwin not only escaped to Syracuse, but in March of 1860 wrote a testy letter to his former owner, chastising her for demanding money from him and for having sold his brother and sister. It must be one of the few examples in history of an angry correspondence between former slave and master. By 1972, however, the militants that had inspired Reverend Logwin's 1850 escape to Syracuse and later to Canada obviously no longer existed in the Logwin bloodline. William Logwin had become as remote from his forebears as most white judges are from each other. It is proof, I suppose, of the observation that it is grand to be well descended, but that the glory belongs to the ancestors. Following the complaint against me by the PBA and the censure of the Judiciary Relations Committee, my life on the bench changed drastically, and I was beset by doubts whether I should continue in a career I had never hoped or prepared for. The threats to my life continued apace, as did the deluge of racist condemnation in signed and unsigned letters and cards. I continued to endure the status of a well-paid but not very trusted clerk. I sat in review of reports made by counselors which recommended either dismissal or criminal charges or a further period of counseling. I stamped papers and spoke fatherly cliches to young offenders. Had it not been for the friendship of Eugene Hanley, the youth park clerk, I would have done practically no judicial work for almost 18 months. He recognized what the administration of David Ross was doing, as it seemed to yield to the strident demands of the police that I be controlled and isolated from all work involving the setting of bail. Hanley, feigning an innocent eagerness to help those judges whose parts were overburdened with long calendars, surreptitiously brought cases to me for hearings and motions. I would conduct such proceedings in a sub rosa atmosphere, as though doing the business of a secret court. For his outspoken expressions of sympathy for my plight and his independence of mind, Hanley was transferred to different duty in a part of the city as distant from his home as municipal boundaries would allow. He has since retired to the kindlier bleakness of a rural Rhode Island address. My fellow judges accepted my banishment as normal, and if they discussed it at all, they did so outside the hearing of my friendly spies. Their mute tolerance of my treatment was a tribute to the blindness of their focus on personal ambition. Those who spoke to me at all advised against harsh criticism of the system, pointing to the dictatorial power of the court administrators. When Leo Milonis became the supervisory judge of the Manhattan Criminal Court, he looked in on my dirty little backwater of a youth part one day and said, "Jesus, Bruce, you've been here so long. Don't you want a change of assignment?" I had known Milonis when we were both practicing law, and I said, "I dare you to give me some judicial duties." My next assignment was to a jury part. The assignment was listed for a month. It lasted just 2 weeks. Milonis was overruled, and I was sent back to the youth part. From there I was summoned to an arraignment part because of the absence during a religious holiday of the judge then presiding, and it was there that I admonished the officer who had needlessly drawn his weapon and held it close to the head of a black defendant. 10 years after my appearance before the Committee on Judiciary Relations, I received a remarkable letter from the man who had prosecuted me so enthusiastically. He wrote that he owed me an apology long overdue for his role as the committee's counsel in the investigation conducted against you. He said that he had seen 2 movies, The Year of Living Dangerously and Bananas, that made him examine certain premises he held about law and order, racism, and the terrible forces sometimes unjustly unleashed by the government and certain ugly segments of the press against individuals who rocked the boat to upset the establishment. He recalled that there was an hysterical mob screaming for my blood, for being reminded how racism still lives like a cancer in society. He then spoke of society treating poor blacks accused of crimes as niggers and caged animals. He then concluded by writing that instead of an investigation of the horrible conditions I inveighed against, the focus was on the injudicial language used by me. The investigation and prosecution of charges against me were, he said, a miserable episode, and he asked forgiveness for his role in it. Chapter 6. Quotas and Quarrels. Some expression of the attitudes of my colleagues toward me was made public at a Hunter College seminar for trial judges, a program administered by a former civil court judge, Edward Goodell. He asked that I deliver a lecture touching on aspects of racism as they affected criminal justice. I prepared my notes, cited some courthouse graffiti, and added some personal views concerning black judges and their slim numbers. I had 20 minutes to make my points before being exposed to questions from an audience of judges who, if friendly, successfully suppressed any evidence of that emotion. There was tentative laughter when I quoted a piece of wall writing that had been just outside the youth part for more than a year. It referred to a television commercial for tuna fish, in which a garrulous character named Charlie Tuna was never chosen by a company that insisted, in its commercials at least, on only the finest quality. The commercial showed Charlie being caught and cast back into the sea. The legend on the wall read, "Charlie Tuna must be a nigger fish. He's so socially unacceptable." I mention this anecdote for a reason. In the halls outside the courtroom, youthful defendants who had been released on bail on their own recognizance while being counseled often milled about, exchanging stories and their personal views of judges and justice. They smoked, discussed the possibilities of their impending fate, and often debated with their lawyers the competing merits of what options they might have. It is in the halls that practical and piercing insights are expressed concerning justice. Lenny Bruce summed it up in his bitter observation: in the halls of justice, justice is in the halls. That too has become a part of the wall literature of the criminal court. Although it contains no mention of race, the blacks and Puerto Ricans who can read have allowed their street wisdom to adopt the aphorism. They see it applicable to their circumstance. They believe as soon as they enter the courtroom, the judge will show nothing but wrath. They express the view there is no such thing as an honest judge. They seem to wish to be brought before one of their peers, a judge who is an urban peasant, handing out benevolent dismissals. The Charlie Tuna graffiti remained undisturbed for several years. It could be easily read. It was in what Arthur Koestler has described as the neat and legible script of the illiterate. In my speeches and lectures, I have never neglected an opportunity to point out that although 85 to 90% of the criminal court defendants are black and dark Hispanics, there was not a single black or Hispanic supervisory judge in any of the 5 boroughs of the city for many years. Because I hammered at this theme, suggesting that there was distrust of black and Hispanic judges, it was felt in the office of David Ross, the administrative judge for the entire city, that I was somehow betraying private club secrets. One of his closest administrative assistants, the late Archie Gorfinkel, was a burly, hulking figure of a man. He was a natural ally of his boss. His faults of personality were matched by his loud manner of speech and blunt expression. His appearance made him a perfect candidate for typecasting. One day, as I ate lunch in a restaurant near the courts, my table was near one at which he sat. Upon seeing me, he leaped suddenly to his feet. With a menacing flourish, which caused other diners to fall silent, he pointed an accusing finger at me, while yelling at the top of his voice, "You tell lies in your speeches. You're nothing but a liar, and you know it." He had seized on the fact that John Sandifer, a black, was Ross's deputy in charge of the city's criminal courts and the criminal divisions of the Supreme Court. He pointed to Sandifer as support for his public accusation that I had lied when I said there was neither a black nor Hispanic supervisory judge in any of the 5 boroughs. There could have been no more dramatic a demonstration of how Gorfinkel had risen to the height of inaccuracy. He well knew that at the time I had spoken, there was not a single black or Hispanic supervisory judge in each of the 5 criminal courts of the 5 boroughs, but facts were obviously irrelevant to him. Sandifer was not a supervisory judge, but a deputy assistant administrative judge for the city and all of its boroughs. Such a scene was a demonstration of fealty to his then superior more than to accuracy. Having been a supervisory judge in the Bronx, Gorfinkel became an acting Supreme Court justice. After my remarks before the judges at the Hunter College Clinical Seminar, the first questions fired at me was from M. Marvin Berger. He and I had received appointments to the bench at the same time. He had at one time been general counsel to the New York Post before its decline into tabloid sensationalism. I assumed him to be a man of great wisdom. Instead of the promised question, however, he elected to make a speech. Aiming his finger unerringly at me, he accused me of basic dishonesty in saying that of the 100 judges of the criminal court, none of the supervisory judges was black, and only some 10 judges were black. To my amazement, he then said, "There are only 98 on the criminal court." you know there are not 100. I have long been vexed by the large numbers of black and Puerto Rican defendants in the criminal court, and when pressed by questioners as to why, I have sought to wrestle with elusive answers. It seems there are many more advisory services available to whites who still reside in the city or who are arrested there. Advice is available through religious organizations or other social service groups. Seldom does a white Catholic youth, for example, appear before the arraignment bar without a representative either of his church or of some other group to vouch for his stability and trustworthiness in returning to court when needed. Such representatives gives the court a sense of trust in looking after the defendant and offering help while his case is pending. Invariably, such support results in the defendant's pre-trial release. Often it also results in a reduction of the charges and, sometimes, their eventual dismissal. Support services also exist for the few Jewish defendants who are caught up in the system of criminal justice. In New York, most of the white Protestants have fled elsewhere for a variety of reasons, including a public school system that is overwhelmingly black and Puerto Rican, and thus subject to cruel and heedless treatment by those who run it. The white Protestants have also avoided the changing neighborhoods, which, through what the sociologists have called succession and invasion, have become darker and darker as the so-called inner city has spread like an ethnic Rorschach. The Protestants in New York City today are, in the main, black, and despite the ever-increasing number of charismatic, Pentecostal, and emotional sects among the Hispanics who are Protestant, the Protestant Federation has abdicated any activist role in fending for them. The Federation has become the private club of a handful of brooding do-gooders. It justifies its existence as a social agency by having meetings and boxed lunches calculated not to offend urban peasants. There are always a few token blacks on the board, but because this membership serves only to certify its middle-class visions, whatever is social about the Federation seems restricted to its internecine gatherings. I served on the board briefly when it was thought mistakenly that I was a Protestant. The failure of the Protestant Church to meet its obligations to its black members is a scandal. Protestants could be kept busy providing to black defendants the counseling and court assistance that is routinely available to Catholic and Jewish defendants. This lack in the lives of young black Protestants helps increase the deprivation of choices and options that the minority poor might otherwise have. My expression of some of these views at the Hunter College seminar met with bitter disagreement among my fellow speakers and questioners. Some of these critics voiced opinions later to be developed by Charles H. Silberman. In a 1978 book, Criminal Violence, Criminal Justice, he seems to attribute the large number of black criminal defendants to an innate savagery and an instinctive racial compulsion. He then writes that he is astonished by black violence because the poor black creatures captured in Africa and sold into slavery were gentle. Violence, he says, was not a part of their baggage. As though blacks made happy landfalls in America as African tourists instead of us as kidnapped contraband. Silberman offers no mention of slavery's dreadful insult to American piety and the Constitution. Neither does he engage the terrible penalty even now being imposed on the generations coming after slavery and its abolition. One finds in his acid pages no criticism of the United States Constitution, which American history describes as the most perfect instrument for governance ever drawn by the hand of man. His pages are bereft of sensitive consideration either of cause or consequence of the black circumstance in the centuries of white Christian deprivation and degradation represented by slavery, or in the post-emancipation years of benighted and tethered human intercourse, so blemished by the sight of skin color, and so much a flawed replica of the apartheid holding sway in South Africa. My constant jeopardy arising from accusations against me began to be a matter of acute concern to my family and to myself as well. I began to feel completely isolated, a pariah, avoided by my colleagues as though I had become a leper. It was then that I began to think of a new career and to deplore the day I had given up my practice to join the Lindsay administration. The realization of powerlessness in the face of threat can be a forceful catalyst for self-pity and fruitless anger. It occurred to me that, at my time of life, I needed no such nonsense as the unending stream of racist letters and anonymous promises of maiming and death. My fellow members of the bench stood mute, failing to appreciate that if the administration could treat me in a special way, they too could become victims. It was a lonely battle to oppose those in whose hands the fate of one's career rested. This was especially true in my case, because I belonged to no political party and had no friends in places of power. In retrospect, I understand the acidity of a passage from The Gift of Chaos by Dr. Anna Arnold Hedgeman. She mentions the complete divestment of relationship and personality felt by black Africans brought to this country in slave ships and placed among strangers in a hostile land. They came without passports, without visas, without tickets of passage, and without knowledge of direction or destination. It was ridiculous then to expect blacks to celebrate the bicentennial, as it would have approved the scandal of Christians owning slaves under a constitution and its glorious mentions of freedom. Some reservation surfaced during the extravagant adoration of the Statue of Liberty and its centennial. 100 years ago, a large part of this country was busy undoing Reconstruction and the post-Civil War constitutional amendments. During my ordeal by harassment and being ignored and avoided by my colleagues, I felt I was an actor in a foreign language drama. I could not define my role, and in any case, there was no audience. My efforts at escape only worsened my sense of exile. I allowed my name to be considered as a law instructor at the New York University Law School. I was told by the black students who urged my cause that some of the school expressed the belief that I was too old to undertake such a new career. It seemed alien to their mission somehow for those associated with a law school to abuse the law by discriminating against someone because of age. In my early 50s, I seemed to have become an outcast for reasons both of age and racial impertinence. The PBA intensified its barrage in the efforts to have me unfrocked. Kenneth McFeely and before him Robert McKiernan as PBA presidents had used vituperation against me as a means of achieving popularity with their association and election to office. Both had pledged to work unceasingly to have me drummed off the bench. They detested my criticism of trigger-happy officers to whom blacks had become a target and whom shot to kill when confronted by blacks. I deplored the killer instinct, seemingly aroused in so many white police officers by the sight of black skin. I expressed the view that New York had deteriorated into a police state where no white police officer would ever be convicted for the slaying of a black. Newspapers and television reporters had taken up the term "Turn 'em loose Bruce" as a derogatory title, making capital of public fear and hysteria over crime. Editorials abounded in their harsh criticism of me, revealing a deep ignorance of the criminal justice system and the Constitution itself. The few favorable comments in the press never received the prominence of the negative reports. It seemed that I was being told that for this black judge at least, there was no such thing as a First Amendment right to free speech. The attempt to stop my protest was all the more interesting because my most severe remarks had not been made from the bench or even the courthouse. I was astonished to be told that a law school forum, for example, was an improper place to discuss controversy, and that such conduct would expose me to a wide range of severe penalties. I had no idea how the law could escape dispute, investigation, debate, contradiction, and a ceaseless inquiry made with the zeal of an honest quest. Donald Shapiro, the dean of New York Law School, sought me out for a position on the law school's adjunct faculty. By a vote of 3-2, the faculty committee turned me down. Dean Shapiro suggested there should be another try later because he had been absent on business when the vote came up. Had the vote been reversed, it would have been little better for me because it suggested that I would be transferring my vulnerability to another arena of enmity. Anyway, as I told Shapiro, I would have been at that time but a sorry token, the one quota black. Naturally, few bigots concede that their rulings are made on the basis of racist animus. Even some white judges had long ago noticed that persons and institutions will always assign a variety of discovered reasons for rejection of blacks that have no apparent roots in racism. If a racist rejection represents an act of inhumanity, it is often, nevertheless, the fashionable and thus acceptable thing to do, and that makes it respectable. I long became resigned to such explanations, although hardly immune. My own impression of what the sight of color can do to a white mind had begun with my exclusion from Princeton's skating rink in 1935, and shortly thereafter my rejection from Princeton University itself. That was a long time ago, but changes of attitude seem to have escaped any alteration of feelings about color in America. Michael Sovereign, before he became president of Columbia University, came to my home for dinner one evening. He was then dean of the university's law school. After an exemplary meal and some exquisite red Margot, I brought the conversation around to Alexander Hamilton and asked Sovereign if Hamilton had been the first black to attend Columbia. He seemed startled by my conclusion that Hamilton had been a Negro and appeared to know nothing about the historical notion of Hamilton's shadowy West Indian background and the birth on the island of Nevis. I tried to assuage his apparent distress by assuring him that it was not the worst DNA tragedy in the world because we already knew the scandal of the first black president of the United States, Warren G. Harding. I was giving him some dark and gossipy insights into American history as it is sometimes discussed in black neighborhoods or by historians. I recommend to him a biography of Harding in which Harding himself is quoted as asking a close friend, "Do you really think I'm part nigger?" And then I arrived at the real part of the discussion, the controversy surrounding my career and my search for a more compatible intellectual atmosphere. I had assumed, incorrectly as it developed, that each of us was more tolerant of the other and much more mellow than in a non-alcoholic moment. I posed the ultimate question, which ruined the evening and brought about the pall of silence at a dinner table that precedes embarrassed declarations of reasons for uncomfortable guests to depart. I said, "Mike, what are my chances for doing some adjunct teaching at the law school?" As calmly as though he heard such questions on a daily basis from black supplicants for his favor, Sovereign replied, with an even gaze at me, "But Bruce, we already have one." Once again, I had the old token defense, the quota limitation thrown at me. One was the quota. One was white society's favor, its generous boon, its grudging academic handout from the intellectual welfare rolls. Kellis Parker was the law school's lone black professor, and that was that. We made the usual polite goodbyes, and I had not spoken to him since. I did write to him to ask if he recalled his remark, and his reply was that the quotation attributed to him sounded more like something I would say. The sense of repugnant controversy that enveloped my professional life also spread beyond the seas. In my search for other avenues along which to express my energies, I had several interviews with a law firm in the West Indies. Just when partnership details were being discussed, 8 people were killed by dissident blacks in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. I was told that I was too controversial, and under no circumstances could I join the firm then interviewing me. I could not escape, it seemed, and in New York the fever pitch of racist events continued. Racism is practiced, overtly and otherwise, as instinctive ritual. It seeps into all aspects of life. It is amazing to see how many white people still cling to the pre-emancipation conviction that all Negroes look alike. It would be much less astonishing if blacks believed all whites look alike. Certainly they have a more uniform skin color than blacks. The astonishment derives from the visual fact that since all whites are nearly the same color, it would not seem surprising if blacks must believe all whites look alike. Clearly the color whites call black skin excites similar emotions in them. When McGeorge Bundy headed the Ford Foundation, he once summoned a number of blacks, myself included, to his home on Fifth Avenue. He wanted to sample black thoughts about the restlessness of black students at Yale University. He was scheduled to go to New Haven to offer palliatives to soothe their agitation and sedate their sense of rebellion. They were deeply involved in the emotions of a Black Panther trial then just beginning, and they also wished Yale to withdraw all its investments in South Africa. Although I was aware of the troubled black spirit there, I had no idea that Bundy's invitation was an effort to get black ideas on how to prevent black agitation from becoming action that might embarrass Yale. I reported precisely at the appointed Sunday afternoon hour. The doorman, an aged Irish servitor, was a starched serf who had brought to the 20th century all of the prejudices he believed his upper-class tenants supported. He looked at me suspiciously and, with his spare and unsturdy body placed squarely in my path, demanded to know my business. In his rigid severity, he seemed to believe he was as heroic as the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike. My business was none of his, and I felt that he would never have asked a white visitor such a question in such a tone of hostility. I said simply, "Tell Mr. McGeorge Bundy that Bruce Wright is on his way up." I sought in vain to be as haughty in my attitudes as the whites whom he doubtless welcomed daily in his cherished high-rise castle. I failed, of course, for there are few members of ancient and dynastic royalty who can be as superior as those urban peasants who are dormant for the rich. He said, "You must use the service elevator," and he called to a junior employee to show the way. I ignored him. I was not surprised, but angry. I walked straight to the passenger elevator with its mirrors and a bench on one side. I said to the elevator man, "The Bundy apartment, please," and pretended to be preoccupied with my newspaper as I sat down. There was a hurried discussion between agitated uniformed men. I suggested that I should be taken up immediately or that the police be called, although I had no idea what the police could do in such a situation. There was always the ponderous machinery of the State Commission on Human Rights, and I began to wonder if an elevator ride was a civil right. A white man then entered the elevator, barely looked at me, and began to read his newspaper. For him, the elevator man began his ascent, and I was delivered. As I entered the Bundy apartment, my face must have reflected my anger. Bundy said, "My God, Bruce, you look like a dark cloud. What happened?" His simile did nothing to help my mood. I described the antebellum hauteur of the doorman. He then exclaimed spontaneously as his face clouded over and he looked at his wife, "Perhaps I should have told them before." He and his wife and an enormous dog then exited the apartment in unison, each wearing an expression of distress and anxiety. Left alone, I sought to salvage something of the afternoon by going to a window facing Central Park and musing on the birds that hovered over the nearby reservoir. When the Bundys and their pet returned, they asked in a make-conversation way what I was gazing at. I asked what kind of birds were obviously having their own Sunday afternoon meeting. No one knew. I offered the opinion that they must be local Jim Crows, perhaps. It was a harsh remark, but no less spontaneous than Bundy's. Perhaps I should have told them. After that, the silence was almost visible as we awkwardly awaited the late arrivals. When the others finally gathered, I had very little to say, feeling that I would be something of a quisling to aid and abet the Bundy cause of controlling some intellectually restless black students. I remained busy, speculating on the powerful people in American society who are essentially stars in the strange pageant of the country's democracy, but who nevertheless allow so many walk-ons, the extras, to be the agents of the animus which diminishes theories of equality. It is in that way that a drama of gloom is authored for blacks. It has always been so, from the time in 1789 when Thomas Jefferson, with pious hypocrisy, had purported to hate slavery and had even proposed freedom for the blacks at the Constitutional Convention and thereafter. He appeared to wish an egalitarian, libertarian, and revolutionary concept to apply to all. That aim was soundly defeated. Of course, Jefferson had set a poor example by appearing at the convention as one of Virginia's largest slave owners. Instead of freeing his slaves, either before or after the convention, he returned to Monticello, brimming with Christian faith, to enjoy his slaves, and especially his long-lasting liaison with Sally Hemings, his black mistress. He ultimately freed his children by Miss Hemings, but never freed her. I mention these incidents simply to show that my experiences should have prepared me to be astonished about nothing. And yet both astonishment and dismay are constant trespasses on my sense of awareness. I assume that I suffer from a weakness of character, and that weakness continues to dupe me into believing that people of power, the white majority, will use influence to urge national support for the blessings of liberty. All too often it seems that the fulfillment of a constitutional ideal is desired only by blacks. It is as though the dead hand of a mortgage forecloses for blacks those blessings so carefully spelled out in the original Constitution for whites only. Sloane Coffin was emphatically accurate when he observed in one of his sermons that people of power have no good will and people of good will have no power. My amazements leave me bruised. The American ethos and its enslavement to ignorance seem to compel white America to reserve its harshest treatment for citizens who are unfashionably dressed in black skin. This includes all of those beautiful and in-between colors that are not black at all but are called so only in reference to people. All of my experiences should have provided a course preparation for what was to be witnessed in the court system. They were certainly numerous enough. After my first year at college, I was hired for a job as a lifeguard at the small prestigious Camp Moosehead in New Canaan, Connecticut. I dutifully reported and was welcomed by the Filipino cook, who happened to be a Bible school student. Mrs. Jerome, who ran the camp, was obviously shocked at seeing me. "Who are you?" she asked. When I told her that one of my professors had arranged summer work for me at the camp, she said, "There must be some mistake. We asked for a lifeguard, not another cook." She admonished me not to go into the lake under any circumstances while she sought a replacement for me. In the meantime, I was provided with a long wooden pole and instructed to sit in a rowboat and watch over the wealthy young boys as they swam. I was given a sleeping bag and a place to sleep over a garage. The cook and I became fast friends and swam in the lake every morning and evening. I ignored Mrs. Jerome's instructions. The cook was as amused as I was about her distress. One night, as I helped the cook while he served the Jeromes and their two sons, the telephone rang. I answered and was told that it was for Donald, one of Mrs. Jerome's sons, known as Donnie. The cook asked me to inform Donnie. I looked into the dining room and said, "Excuse me, but there's a telephone call for Donnie." Mrs. Jerome, with a startled look on her face, rose immediately and advanced on me in a menacing manner. As we both entered the kitchen, she was livid as she shouted, "My son is Mr. Donald, do you understand?" I said, "Of course, if he's Mr. Donald to me, then I'm Mr. Bruce to him." Donnie could not have been more than a year or so older than I was. I was angry at this antebellum demonstration of the caste system. The next day, Mrs. Jerome summoned me to her office. She asked me if I were a communist, said she had never asked for a colored lifeguard, and told me I was discharged. She said that Mr. Donnie would drive me to the train. In some ways, I suppose, Camp Moosehead was like a YMCA camp I had attended as a young boy. In the 1930s, the YMCA was just another institution waging pious racism, with separate facilities for blacks. It operated a camp in northern New Jersey called Camp Washington. For 10 days, Negro boys were there, and then, for the next 10, only whites. As my contingent left one year, I was part of the cleanup force. The camp had to be prepared for the white campers. One of my duties was to remove the picture of Booker T. Washington from over the dining hall fireplace and put up a picture of George Washington. Booker T. had not been a slave owner, but a slave. It was an ironic comment on theories of racial acceptance in America that a slave owner's image was framed for white youths and that of a former slave for the blacks. That kind of suggestion must have had great influence in preserving the separate but equal myth. Dealings with generations of white men failed to cure me of my naive belief that education was the way to reform a delinquent society, and yet the educated classes in America, and those belonging to groups that determine policy and have power, are reluctant to use their power to heal the wound that gives America so much illogical anguish. When I came to the bench, I automatically assumed that I would be in the midst of men of great learning and dignity. I believed that they would have a sacred respect and love for the Constitution, and a zealous devotion to be fair, just, and objective. I neglected to take into account the emotional turbulence generated in whites when they are confronted by a black person accused of crime, especially when that accusation involves a white person as the victim. Black individuality, emerging from the amorphous mass of unworthy darkness, seems to intensify distrust, as does my sign of black independence. The latter often results in a black being thought of as a cheeky nigger, or worse, and there are built-in penalties for displays of what might be construed as black arrogance or self-assertion. Despite my long basic training in the endurance of American hostility, I remain bitterly awe-stricken by the ignorance of many white judges on the subject of human relations. Perhaps my error in putting together a suitable syllogism is my underlying premise that blacks too are human. Many whites with whom I've had close relationships have radically stereotyped concepts about the black personality. An impossible dream has occurred to me in which all blacks have staged a national paint-in, and every black domestic, laborer, radical, and activist has managed to sedate all whites with a secret drug and then paint them black. This, of course, is a desperately unrealizable fantasy because many black domestics seem to revere their white employers and would never think of doing anything out of character. That black men have stood mute when their rage should have compelled them to scream, to rant, to rave, and to be insane has never ceased to amaze me. I continue to cling to the belief that those who know must speak out. When I was still on the bench and filled with the wonder of the power that comes with a black robe and allows one to imprison others, to impose fines, and to deliver lectures on morality, I persisted in using my free time to watch the other judges do their work. Some cynics say that this is one way to compound error if such examples are followed. Even before my career on the bench began, I would watch judges carefully. As a young lawyer, I wanted very much to know something about the judges I would be practicing before. I was not a member of any organizations except a poor minority track and field club. I had no political influence and was not enrolled in a party. I had heard stories of how lawyers would deliberately call a judge's attention to the small symbols of Freemasonry they wore in their lapels, and of how that sense of fraternity often helped a cause when merit had no place. One day I sat with Livingston Wingate, who was now a judge, as he waited in a courtroom to seek an adjournment so that he could be elsewhere on another mission. The presiding judge was George Carty. Because of the numerous blacks and Puerto Ricans who are defendants in the criminal courts, I was surprised to see that a white defendant stood before the bench to be sentenced, having earlier been convicted. His lawyer, also white, made an eloquent plea to Judge Carney, asking that his client be placed on probation and not sent to jail. He assured the judge that the defendant could be rehabilitated. Counsel's entire air was one of absolute certainty and knowledge, which I thought would be impossible for the judge to resist. Judge Carney appeared to be thumbing impatiently through a pre-sentence report then before him. When the defendant's lawyer completed his argument, Carney lifted his head and vehemently snarled a concussive question. "How's he going to be rehabilitated when he's living with a colored woman?" As though the attributed criminality of such an outrageous and heinous deed required re-emphasis, Judge Carney repeated his question twice. His first expression of the question roused in me some anger. I realized that I too was living with what the judge had contemptuously described as a colored woman. There raced through my head recollections of the infamous Scottsboro case, when 9 young men had been accused of raping 2 white women who were later described as prostitutes. White men in the South had rallied, as they said, to the support of the honor of the abused white women. So aroused were Southern whites by the accusations against the Scottsboro defendants that they hungered to lynch the black youths and thus accelerate the justice a trial would delay. As I listened to Judge Carney's question, it occurred to me that the least I could do was protest in the name of the honor of black women. There was no suggestion in Judge Carney's condemnation that the colored woman involved was a prostitute, or that she suffered from anything other than her color. I rose to do battle and walked quickly toward the bench, announcing as I approached that I was a member of the bar and an officer of the court. I asked if I might be heard on the question of the alleged infamy of living with what His Honor referred to as a quote-unquote colored woman. With my anger in full charge, as though daring the judge to hold me in contempt, and with reason thrown to the winds, I said, in as sarcastic a manner as I could manage, "Your Honor, perhaps I can offer you some survival techniques for living with what Your Honor has referred to as a colored woman." I then added, "I believe I may have a bit more experience than Your Honor." The courtroom became as silent as an underground vault, for I had spoken in a loud and insistent voice. It must have been commanding, because court officers trained to quell any such untoward interruption of court protocol seemed stunned. Judge Carney, however, only flushed. I had no way of knowing whether he was angry or embarrassed at the sudden realization of what he had said. He was not abandoned by his sense of what to do. He invoked that saving grace available to all judges. He called a recess and disappeared through the door in back of his bench. Immediately I proceeded to the chambers of the Chief Justice Irving Ben Cooper. I announced my mission to a woman at his reception desk. She seemed alarmed, and it occurred to me that she might be apprehensive about my anger. She remembered the rules, however, and asked if I had an appointment. When I said that I did not, she replied, predictably and with a straight face, that Judge Cooper was not in. I then asked her to let him know my purpose. "Please tell him that it is extremely urgent that Bruce Wright see him about a matter of one of his judges making an offensive racist remark from the bench." As she made notes, her fealty was betrayed by the one she sought to protect. The door in back of her opened, and the Chief Justice emerged. Taking me by surprise, he put one hand on my shoulder as though in a fraternal rite. He seemed earnest and had the unflinching eye contact stressed by social workers. He addressed me as though we were intimates. "Bruce, I know why you're here. There's nothing you can do about Judge Carney that's worse than what he's doing to himself. He's now in his chambers, practically flagellating himself." I was struck by this reference to an ancient religious practice, but I suggested coldly that I would certainly do something worse. Before I could turn to leave, angrier than before because the judge had addressed me as Bruce, as though I were a boy, he said, "Bruce, I'd like to come up and speak to the boys of the Harlem Lawyers Association sometime." I suggested that he should perhaps get in touch with the president of the association, even as I would. It seemed that the Carney incident deserved an emergency meeting by the group. When I called the president, then Lawrence R. Bailey, he too was incensed. We agreed that the racism exhibited by Judge Carney disqualified him from being a judge in New York. Bailey instructed me to prepare a petition for filing with the Appellate Division of the State Supreme Court to seek a hearing in hope of removing Carney from the bench. I prepared the petition in the behalf that the Harlem Lawyers Association finally had a valid issue that could justify its existence and emphasize something beyond the summer frivolity of a boat ride or its seasonal dance. It was also an opportunity to honor black women. I was soon to learn that my jesting family motto, "Things are never as bad as they seem, they are worse," would be realized in Afro-Saxon pomp. A hot debate occurred over the Carney remark. The general feeling was that any protest by the association would affect the political careers of the members and nullify the ambitions of some to become judges or commissioners in the city or state governments. Several members contended that I was not a member of the association, that I was not in politics, that I was a radical and perhaps even a communist, and that the association should not risk its reputation and that of its membership simply because I wanted to press the matter. It was said that I had nothing to lose. Sadly, neither did they. They failed to see that by remaining supine in face of such an insult, they might suffer the deprivation of the little they did have. They could not see that they were forfeiting respect by having none for their wives. They elected to do nothing. A melancholy joke, offered to me as comfort, went that it was strange that the members of the association would not protest the honor of a colored woman because each of them was then living with a colored woman, either his own or someone else's wife. Ultimately, I persuaded the Harlem branch of the NAACP to seek the judge's removal. Judge Jonah Goldstein, who was about to retire from the Court of General Sessions, was appointed to preside over the hearing, and I was a witness. I was told that Judge Carney's lawyer was a close friend of Cardinal Spellman and very influential in the archdiocese. Carney asserted, with some heat, that he did not have a discriminatory bone in his body, although he never denied uttering the words about the odium and incurable detriment of living with a colored woman. He recalled that when New York's first black judge, James S. Watson, was his colleague on the bench of the municipal court, Carney had been the only white judge who would share a room with Watson at judicial conventions. That claim suggested a retroactive absolution and a prospective basis for being shriven of what he denied was a racist remark. Finally, Carney's lawyer dictated a 2-sentence letter of apology to the NAACP, not to the woman with whom the white defendant had been living. The apology was typed by Judge Goldstein's secretary. The lawyer read it and then placed it before Carney for his signature. He immediately signed it without reading it, as though it was an order checked by a clerk for propriety. I raised an objection, suggesting that the apology was that of the lawyer who had dictated it and certainly not that of Judge Carney. He stared at me icily through his rimless glasses and said, "You're trying to crucify me." I assured him that although his sins were regarded as more scandalous than those of St. Augustine, I had no desire either to sanctify or deify him. At the time, Russell Crawford was president of the NAAC branch in Harlem. Despite my anger, he said, "We accept the apology," and that was the end of the matter. I left in disgust, never dreaming that one day I too would be a judge and the target of those who wished to have me drummed off the bench, as the PBA put it. Shortly after his hearing, Carney was promoted to a higher bench. After I became a judge, whenever he and I accidentally shared the same elevator, he habitually executed the Roman's thumbs down gesture behind my back. Other judges asked me from time to time why he did that. I could only reply that it was probably because he believed that I lived with a colored woman and therefore was beyond rehabilitation. Such remarks failed to win friends for me. I never learned what happened to the poor white defendant who had become an unwitting victim of racist reaction because his emotional objectivity had allowed him to select a woman and she him, despite her nettlesome problem of being colored. For years it was recently disclosed neither affirmative action nor the laws against discrimination affected the Congress of the United States, which enacted so much civil rights legislation. Neither has the United States Supreme Court been affected by such legislation. Standing aloof in analytical isolation, the court merely construes statutes and determines whether or not there is any taint of unconstitutional racism in their text or application. Strangely enough, the rich and powerful law firms have long acted as though civil rights laws bear little or no application to them, and yet there has been not one famous lawsuit challenging the absence from such firms of Jews, blacks, and Hispanics. Most of the discrimination cases brought against law firms have been by women who allege sex discrimination. The excuses advanced for sex discrimination have in many ways rivaled the convoluted fictions invented to justify or explain prejudicial exclusions based on race. My own position in the Proskauer firm was very unusual for those days. In 1950, the civil rights movement was unknown. For the most part, my stay there was a happy one and instructive. I left only because I saw no future for me there, and neither did Bernard Lang, then the managing partner. One Christmas Eve, as I worked late into the evening with Lang, he decided to take a break. He invited me into his office for a drink. I did not then drink, but of course did not reject the scotch offered by a senior partner. He was then just completing a detail concerned with the acquisition and merger that came to be known as Federated Department Stores. "Bruce," he said, "I wonder how much it would take to pay us what we're really worth." Such a question was subject to both a flattering and its opposite interpretation. I smiled and said nothing. As the scotch warmed my insides, I remembered that the young associates frequently talked about who could become a partner and when. I was curious about my own possibilities. I recalled the time when Bernard Baruch's brother, Simon, a former ambassador to The Hague, had marched me into Judge Proskauer's office, asking when I would be made a partner. Proskauer growled that he had nothing to do with making such decisions, and he summarily dismissed us. Remembering these events, and aided by my drink, I decided it was an excellent time to ask about my prospects in the firm. I posed the question somewhat nervously, rather amazed that I could do so. Lang responded, "Bruce, let's talk about it at lunch on Monday, okay?" Naturally, I agreed. The architecture and the stained glass at the Lawyers Club had a more pleasant meaning than the conversation at Monday's lunch. I had a Last Supper feeling in the midst of what seemed a money-changing cathedral. We discussed every conceivable subject except my future at the firm. Finally, as Lang was signing the chit, he said, "You know, Bruce, you've raised a rather important career question." He gave me an even look. "I can tell you right now that your chances of becoming a partner are nil. Our clients are not ready for it. However, you can remain with us as long as you like." I was rebuffed, but not terribly surprised, in the sense that surprise is totally unexpected and slashes at cherished visions. Not many whites ever said to a black luncheon guest, "I'm not ready for employment integration." It was always someone else who was not prepared for such a brave and radical experience. I like to think that American color discriminations had hardened me and made me cynical and hard to surprise. But the same idealistic hope that made me attribute such great expectations to the law always left some room for sharp surprise. I was not too attentive to the rest of the conversation. Already and irrevocably, I had decided that I would leave the comforts and discomforts of that firm. I had learned much. The experience was not a total loss. I was then earning more money than my father had ever been paid. I went into private practice with 3 other young and relatively new lawyers. By 1968, I was working in the Lindsay administration as counsel to the Human Resources Administration of the City of New York. The cry of Black Power had echoed throughout the country. Many whites were so fearful and agitated that one would have thought that vengeful blacks seeking to redress the wounds of slavery had captured the secret of the world's most destructive nuclear weapons. A school strike was raging in Brooklyn. Blacks were making bitter charges of racism. Jewish teachers accused the black community of antisemitism. School decentralization was hotly debated, and the Ford Foundation was giving personnel and money to explore its possibilities. Community control was the theme of the city's ghetto leaders. Whites who could do so had either fled to the suburbs or placed their children in private or parochial schools. Public education in New York had suddenly become black and Hispanic. Filled with visions of taking over the civil rights movement from its white directors, blacks demanded more black and Hispanic police officers. The emphasis was not so much on quotas as the need for more of everything.
Chapter 7. Built-in insensitivity. Instead of the beauty associated with color, its ability to inspire and conjure up fantasies, dreams, and joy, the matter of color seemed to pursue me like a demon. The perception of color seems to me a decisive force in human relations and in those that are dehumanizing. The Jews speak of their Holocaust and the destruction of European Jewry. They weed that poisonous garden in poetry, prose, drama, the cinema, and melancholy conversation. They give artificial respiration to 6 million cadavers. Although they seem somewhat timid in condemning the disgraceful role of Pope Pius VII, their condemnation of an insane interlude of world history continues unabated. The condemnation should embrace Christendom and all who posed as faithful to that creed. And yet, America's dark servants, those graduates from slavery who became this country's poorly paid housekeepers, have had their repeated Kristallnachts. Their blood has been wasted through an endurance of Christian hostility. A campaign of terror has been a constant theme in black life, whether at the hands of justice or of the Ku Klux Klan. The color holocaust has crippled millions of black lives in the polite manner of a quote-unquote nice slave owner. Here, torture becomes a part of every day's limited existence. The headlines no longer advertise the American ethos by the details of a lynching. The lynching is covert, as in the form of a sniper firing from ambush. Night riding vigilantes are no longer fashionable. Volunteers in missions of vengeance now shoot from hidden places. The geography of such violence is no longer restricted to places in the rural South. It has moved to Buffalo, Boston, and urban Atlanta. The nailing of testicles to a tree in Georgia has now become the removal of hearts from black victims in upstate New York. The blacks perceive the mysterious ways of justice as they view courthouse consequences in Florida. 4 police officers are acquitted of the charge of murdering a black man despite the testimony of another officer who witnessed it all. In the subsequent riot, both blacks and whites are killed. The first conviction, however, is of a young black man for killing a white. Whether justice triumphs in such a case becomes lost to blacks because they are the ones who are convicted whenever a white is killed. The situation becomes more complicated when a black is killed by a white. Many blacks in the criminal justice system and in unrelated professions are bitterly amused by the white cry of preferential treatment, quotas, affirmative action, and reverse discrimination. These terms wage intellectual and ideological warfare against minority progress. Groups have surfaced demanding white power, as though the locus of power had ever been with the blacks. In some demonstrations, there have been signs proclaiming that the niggers have too much. The blacks, once hunters of the constitutional dream, have now become the hunted, or more correctly, remain the hunted. If it could ever be said that blacks had too much in terms of citizens' rights, it was because white society was used to its blacks having so little, and because that meager measurement had been adopted as the standard. Had whites been treated in America as the blacks have, I feel certain that they long ago would have undertaken either guerrilla warfare or prolonged civil disobedience for their rights. The American Revolution stands as precedent for how much white victims of oppression accept before they rebel. It is thus that the oppressed, when liberated, become the oppressors. Judges, anxious to complete long calendars, believe they have no time for the exploration of learned theories that ask why. Perhaps considering the question of why suggests frightening answers by holding up a mirror to the history that created generations of burdens for today's Americans. For a proper analysis of that system, the harsh realities of color cannot be ignored. Blacks as slaves were forbidden to learn to read or write. After emancipation, too large a segment of society sought to reinstate the bonds of slavery in methodical circumventions of freedom. The one-room shack, with all the amenities of a rural outhouse, sufficed for a black school in the South. The neighborhood concept of education for the young was cherished by and reserved for whites only. For black children attending a segregated classroom, a bus ride of as many as 100 miles a day was not unusual. On the way, they had an opportunity to see gleaming, modern school buildings reserved for whites. Busing in those days was simply accepted as another fact of race separation. It was the rule for blacks and for the wealthy whites whose children were delivered to private schools. But as soon as busing was suggested as a device for integration and as a remedy for the shortcomings of the past, it became a national crime. Once again, the cry of "Save the neighborhood" swept across the land. After all, whites had seceded from urban neighborhoods to flee black incursions. It did not make sense for them to encourage or approve busing into their enclaves. To do so, they felt, would tarnish their mortgages and diminish their suburban isolation. When blacks began to protest against civil service examinations based on long existing and all-white educational values, the cry suddenly became, "We want merit only." They did not mean merit for teaching and the education of blacks, which had been neglected for so many years. It was then a term that was only as flexible as it needed to be to bar black progress. With such democratic devices of majority rule, the wonder is that it took blacks so long to express their resentment and violence and entry into the field of bank robberies and other downtown crimes. The mention to my white colleagues of such surface historical references results in a dismissal of history and a pointing to the advantages of the present. Well, the comment generally goes, whites have been poor also, and they have not committed crimes in the same proportion as blacks. Neither have blacks lynched whites, nor barred them from their churches, their swimming pools, their parks, schools, libraries, neighborhoods, and jobs. Nor have blacks allowed radical vengeance to dictate how they vote to decide a jury verdict. It appears to be otherwise among white jurors, especially when judging blacks or whites accused of killing blacks. In 1977, I was questioning prospective witnesses for a lawsuit in which I was the plaintiff. I had sued the administrative judges of the court system, charging them and some district attorneys in New York with a conspiracy and a racist effort to deprive me of the same rights they accorded white judges and quiescent black judges. The Patrolmen's Benevolent Association was also a defendant in my federal litigation. A jury clerk in the Bronx drew me aside and handed me a sheet of paper from a yellow legal pad. It was the jottings of the foreman of an all-white jury then hearing a case against a black defendant. It had been left in the jury room after the panel had been ushered back into the courtroom. The notations were disjunctive, but nevertheless wholly concerned with a quote-unquote nigger fixation. Some excerpts will illustrate the point. Quote, all niggers have guns, end quote, it began. We should have Russian justice here, that is, just shoot the bastards. Well, we've got to give this nigger a fair trial. Hope the judge likes niggers. It is not that the judge must have affection for blacks, nor is it necessary for jurors to have such a tender emotion. The difficulty is in bringing objectivity and impartiality to a jury in a race-stricken land. It seems inescapable that white judges reach conclusions that reflect white community standards. Most people regard the police as the first line of protection against criminals. Because so many blacks are arrested and charged with criminal conduct, white society normally sides with police and tends to regard officers in the heroic image those guardians project of themselves. The outrage is spoken loudly in the black residential areas of New York every time a white officer is acquitted when charged with killing a black. Such acquittals confirm the oft-repeated belief that no white officer will ever be convicted for shooting a black. Jury verdicts have borne out that view as a fatal statistic. In 1973, Clifford Glover was shot and killed by a white officer named Thomas Shea. When tried for that killing, Shea said, in addition to expressing the belief that he was in danger, that he thought the 10-year-old was an adult robbery suspect. Although this offered little excuse for shooting to kill, it did offer some commentary on the quality of the defense a policeman could make with confidence in a murder case. When Shea was asked if he could not tell the difference between a little boy of 10 and a fully grown man, especially at a distance of just 3 feet, he replied, quote, all I saw was the color of his skin, end quote. Thus did he express an oath of fealty to the nation's color ethic. I believed at the time that such an explicitly public confession, so solemnly sworn, would not only condemn Shea but also reveal police department policy for what it was, is, and always has been. I innocently believed that the jury would convict for such a wanton killing, based, as Shea had said, on the only thing he had seen, the color of the little boy's skin. I was wrong, of course. He was acquitted. It brought little satisfaction to Glover's mother that the police department was so embarrassed by Shea's public display of police feeling and contempt for black skin that it dismissed him. It was a curious circumstance to some that the department appeared to prosecute his dismissal with much more zeal than that used by the Queens County District Attorney in pressing the charge of murder against Shay. That Shay could confess openly his animus against dark skin color and still win acquittal is a melancholy comment on the cheapness of black life and the power of propaganda. The killing of Randy Evans shortly after that of Glover introduced a new police defense, novel and apparently effective. Torsney, a white officer, simply walked up to Evans and put a bullet in his head. Evans, a teenager, was doing nothing but standing near where he lived. Torsney claimed that an attack by a rare form of epilepsy made him do it. He too was acquitted. With so much black on black crime, one would tend to think that even blacks regard black life as cheap and as worthless as does white society. It has been said that blacks are not held to such a strict and rigorous standard of accountability when they are in conflict with other blacks. One judge is reported to have said, regarding a case in which a black defendant was acquitted and his accuser was also black, quote, "If this, the accuser, had been a white man, the black man would have been convicted. Negroes in cases of this type receive more than equal rights. Juries seem to think it's okay for them to cut, for it's another colored person that is cut." End quote. The hard fact is that all too often, a black is rewarded with a minimal rap on the wrist for harming another black. But if a black harms or deprives a white, the judicial whip lashes out at him. Pretty much the same conclusion was reached in a 1966 study done by Harry Calvin and Hans Zeisel on the subject of how racist influences affect both judges and jurors in America. It was there demonstrated, if any demonstration was needed, that many jurors refused to divorce themselves from the racism and prejudice that are a part of their everyday existence. One white juror, among the many interviewed for the study, put into perspective the general feelings expressed by most when he said of his judgment of a black defendant, "Niggers have to be taught to behave. I feel that if he hadn't done that, he'd probably done something else, probably even worse, and that he should be put out of the way for a good long while." Private vengeance brought to public judgment may be found in a distressing and melancholy pageant acted out before my eyes in the New York City Criminal Court. It was 1970. At the time, I was new on the bench and simply observing what went on in the courtrooms of the experienced judges. I sat on a front row bench, hoping to learn something. In a striking example of the urgency with which the police arrest black men, I saw an enormous black man standing beside the defense counsel before the bench. His afro hairdo was in a state of disarray. He stared straight ahead, wearing the expression of a fierce stoic. It was a cold February day, but he wore no shoes. His only clothing was trousers and a soiled and flimsy undershirt. He could have been a statue. He was a breathing, still life. His presence suggested to me the image of an African chief captured by slavers. To his right, at a table reserved for the district attorney, sat a man barely recognizable as white. He was swathed in bandages from head to toe. One arm was in a sling. The other arm had a cane crooked over it. He remained seated, I imagined because of his wounded condition. The white judge, an excitable man of some years, seemed deeply moved by the pietism of the bandaged victim. He rose to his feet and leaned over the end of the bench and asked, "My God, man, what has happened to you?" The man lifted his cane weakly, and it trembled as he pointed at the black defendant. He was a speaking mummy. "He cut me, Your Honor," he replied. His voice sounded as though it rasped from a distant echo chamber. In an extraordinary example of contempt for the presumption of innocence, the judge moved swiftly to the other side of the bench and asked sternly of the black man, "Why did you cut him that way?" Before his lawyer could intervene, and without a second's hesitation, the defendant answered, He called me a black nigger, that's why. He continued to stare straight ahead, now with a trace of anger and defiance on his face. The judge, reaching for that wisdom which mythology says is inseparable from the task of judging, shook his head from side to side, remonstrating. But don't you know that when he heals and sees his scars every morning when he shaves, he's going to call you the same thing? This colloquy was ended suddenly when the black man said tersely and with some heat, "I better not hear the motherfucker." There was instant clapping and laughter from the blacks in the courtroom. It was not at all humorous. It was the tragedy of one revolutionary standing alone, a single rebel against forces that victimized millions of others. The classical symmetry of the victim aiding and abetting his own defeat. I felt also that the judge himself had defeated justice. I hoped I would never be that kind of judge. How has America changed since the abolition of slavery? The question, of course, is addressed to the country's politics of sociology. It has to be admitted that conditions differ from those of the days of Dred Scott, when that slave had to sue to have determined the question of whether or not he had a right to sue to have determined the question of whether or not he had the right to sue. The judicial system has been altered in some ways. It has been faithful to the precept of reluctant change and, like Dowson's lover of Sinara after its fashion, the nine competing opinions of the United States Supreme Court in the case of Furman v. Georgia allowed 5 of the justices to offer a fleeting solace that the death penalty was unconstitutional. But it was left to Justice Thurgood Marshall to write that it is discriminatorily applied against the poor and members of minority groups, not to mention against men and women. Ethel Rosenberg, of course, is an exception. In her execution and that of her husband can be discovered entire areas of judicial discrimination having nothing to do with color but everything to do with American anti-Semitism. Mr. Justice Douglas also agreed that the penalty should be abolished if it discriminates against one by reason of his race, religion, wealth, social position, or class, and if imposed under circumstances that allow room for the play of such prejudices. Douglas was consistent in the Furman case with his prior dissent in Francis v. Rensweber. There, a young black man, Willie Francis, had been sentenced to death after, quote, difficult preparation for execution, unquote. The executioner pulled the switch and a current of electricity surged through the boy's body intended to cause his death. But the chair had malfunctioned and young Francis did not die. The state of Louisiana repaired both Francis and the chair, and the authorities readied the death chambers once again to carry out the execution. Lawyers intervened, claiming that the 8th Amendment to the Constitution barred a second experience in the chair because it would be cruel and unusual punishment. When the case came to the Supreme Court, Douglas dissented. The majority held, in effect, that Francis had been sentenced to death, that he had not died, and that it would not offend the Constitution to carry out the death sentence. It is a unique case. It has happened only to a black person. The case has excited scholarly law review comment, and one author is completing a book about Willie Francis. While I am not at liberty to reveal what the author's research uncovered, it can be said that the conclusion is that Francis was the victim of a monstrous frame-up. One of the most powerful arguments against the death penalty is that sometimes irreversible mistakes are made and the wrong person is executed. At a recent conference in Washington on minority problems in criminal justice, A Japanese American federal judge recalled his childhood days in an American concentration camp. That the Supreme Court referred to those camps as relocation centers did not ease the harsh fact that American citizens of Japanese ancestry were summarily uprooted and forcefully evacuated from the West Coast shortly after Pearl Harbor was bombed. No presumption of innocence protected them. They were treated as criminals, although no criminal charges were filed. The government announced that it had reasonable ground to act to prevent sabotage and espionage. Mr. Justice Douglas did not file a dissent in those cases, much to the distress of those of us who looked on him as a lonely conscience of the court during World War II. One was left to wonder if his youth on the West Coast had somehow affected his view of Americans of Japanese ancestry. He reached his Furman views on the death penalty circuitously through the Rosenberg case. Although in Rosenberg, the Supreme Court had declined to review the death sentence, subsequent writs were presented the court in an effort to bar the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They had been convicted of espionage under a 1917 statute. But a few days before their execution, Douglas had issued a stay. The full court, in an extraordinary summer session, vacated it, and the Rosenbergs were put to death several hours later. It was then that Douglas filed his dissent, urging that they not be executed. We now know from a book by James F. Simon that some of Douglas's colleagues disapproved of the stay and dissent, believing he had given both simply for the publicity value. The records of the Supreme Court reveal that Douglas had voted to deny review of the Rosenberg case on 5 separate occasions. I had always viewed the refusal of the High Court to review the Rosenberg appeal as the last act in a ritual sacrifice of human beings to the god of anti-Semitism, as reflected during the McCarthy era in America. That there was a Jewish judge and a Jewish prosecutor does nothing to modify the intensity of national emotion generated by the Rosenberg trial. Rabbi Wise and Cardinal Spellman joined in a widely publicized effort to abate some of the anti-Semitism of the time. A young Jewish volunteer for the army was found, and he took his oath on the steps of City Hall with great fanfare and notice. Trained and shipped to career, he was predictably killed. While many recall the Rosenbergs, few remember the young Jewish man and the desperate rituals that led to his death. Some things need to be mentioned because Jews are a minority, albeit a white one, in American society, and I have long classified them with blacks as an endangered species in a Christian society. That my Jewish friends do not share this vision of right-wing and conservative sway in American life and the jeopardy it suggests does not lessen its impact on me, nor is it pleasant to see how many American Jews themselves have become a part of the conservative census. In Mr. Justice Frankfurter, it was known as judicial restraint, a surprising attitude for a man who had been such an activist that he was prominent in the celebrated Sacco and Vanzetti Defense Committee. Although he could vote to reverse the Mississippi conviction of, quote, a poor devil of a young Negro lad, end quote, he could exhibit another aloof side. He voted, for example, against allowing the law clerks of the justices to have a Christmas party in the courthouse, to which colored messengers would be invited. On a national basis, apart from the civil rights movement and its Jewish heroes and heroines, the lean toward conservatism appears to have been led by the American Jewish Committee. Ironically, the push in that direction seems to have begun in the midst of the libertarian 1960s. In 1963, Commentary, the official publication of the committee, published as its lead article an essay entitled My Negro Problem and Yours. In that long and rambling piece, Norman Potterhertz, Commentary's editor, reviewed his troubled relationship with black youngsters in the Brooklyn neighborhood of his youth. While proclaiming that the wholesale merging of the two races is the most desirable through assimilation and, let the brutal word come out, miscegenation, he nevertheless realized that he would not want his daughter to marry one. Since that time, Commentary has had a succession of articles clinging to middle American conservatism on the country's ethnic dilemma. Commentary has adopted black Thomas Sowell as its resident Afro-Saxon. In the stodginess of his views on blacks and his condemnation of them for relying, as many do, on welfare contributions and federal anti-poverty programs, he emerges as an arch conservative. In allying himself with the enemies of black progress through government-sponsored social programs, he seems to be ashamed of his blackness, but without it he would not be the useful favorite son and dark pamphleteer he now is for the views of Commentary. One of his 1978 essays is titled with the question, Are quotas good for blacks? Earlier, in another edition of the magazine, Midge Decter had delivered a harsh polemic titled Looting and Liberal Racism. She did not think the looters during the New York City blackout of 1977 should be referred to as animals. She preferred scurrying urban insect life to the imagery of the jungle. Apparently, she wished to keep comparison as close as she possibly could to the roaches that infest poor neighborhoods. In 1978, Joseph Adelson took to the pages of Commentary to write his opposition to living with quotas. He felt that any concept of quotas in education was a deception for marginal or unqualified minorities, and that their promotion would be a corruption both of language and conduct. It reminded me of a dinner in the luxurious suburb of Rye, New York, at which I was the black guest. I sat next to a teacher who had taught at Hunter College High School. She bemoaned what she called the misdirected power of the black students there in persuading the school system to teach Swahili. She shook her head as she said, "This year we'll teach Swahili. Next semester we'll teach remedial Swahili." In the best Commentary tradition, she presented a stunning example of the social and intellectual contempt reserved for black studies and ambition. In 1976, Michael Novak's Commentary contribution had been titled Race and Truth. He emphasized that job quotas, charity, subsidies, preferential treatment tend to undermine self-reliance and pride of achievement. Other articles in the 1970s have covered such issues as Western guilt and third world poverty, P.T. Bauer, and the De Funi and Baki cases, which went to the Supreme Court. The magazine's thematic bête noire has been Kenneth Clark, with Andrew Young as a late contender for that title. It is almost as though Commentary's conservative argument against black goals has had some effect and influence on white judges in their regard for the large number of blacks who appear before them. And so there has been change in the atmosphere of America. It is not the change that was hoped for as a result of the egalitarian activities in the 1960s. That decade is but a memory now, and the affectionate alliance between Jews and blacks seems as distant as another planet. Conditions for black lawyers as well have changed little. Perhaps They can now feel better when entering most courthouses, almost as though they have someone there they know or know about. There are now some black judges and clerks in almost every courthouse in New York City and in most of the other large cities of the country. They are there by virtue of a quota system that differs from the one the enemies of quotas are anxious to nullify. Either by deliberation or inadvertence, blacks are severely restricted in their ambition to become judges. Most often, when election time comes around, the black politicians may be given a quota of one judge for the Supreme Court or the Civil Court. Black lawyers are still regarded with suspicion, as though they do not meet white standards. There are implicit insults, even in remarks meant as compliments. My own work product has been described as excellent by critical clerks, but only because I once associated with a white law firm. They would not say I was hired because of my preparation. Whites have an historical insensitivity that makes them remote and aloof from the depleting significance of being black in America or in South Africa. Although the two apartheids can be distinguished, they are nonetheless generically linked. Both rely on attitudes, rewards, and deprivations derived from theories of racial superiority on the one hand and racial inferiority on the other. Judges, both black and white, reared and living in New York City, have all too often revealed themselves as seemingly unaware of the insults built into such a system and way of life. Long before FM became popular or even existed, the one non-commercial radio station that broadcast daily and evening programs of classical music was the city's own WNYC. Its distinguished director for so many years was Seymour Siegel. In addition to the Sunrise Symphony, there were programs of folk songs and jazz. One day, to my amazement, I heard some darky songs being sung. The composer was Stephen Foster. As a black taxpayer, it occurred to me that I did not have to tolerate racist antebellum hymns to the happiness of slavery on publicly owned radio. I therefore began a protest dialogue with Siegel. He was understanding and assured me that no such lyrics would be sung on that station in the future. They were played again, of course, by a rebellious all-white staff who accused me of being a book burner and a latter-day Nazi. During the 1950s, the New York City Housing Authority began a construction of a low-rent development in the midst of Harlem. A large sign advertised its name, the Stephen Foster Houses. I addressed a protest to the chairman of the authority, pointing out the insult to Harlem's black citizens implicit in a housing monument to the memory of Foster. The chairman, although unable to see anything insulting to blacks, referred me to the member of the authority responsible for naming the project. The member was Frank Crosswaith, a black man, famous in Harlem as one of the founders of the Harlem Labor Union. Exchanging correspondence with him confirmed once again that insensitivity and the tacit racial insult escapes the notice of some blacks as well as whites. His letter to me was brief and biting. It said, "Dear Sir, I do not often respond to crank letters. However, you should know that the songs of Stephen Foster prepared the North for the migration of the Negro." I could not resist responding, and I asked him what such songs did for those Negroes who remained in the South, assuming that his first statement had any validity. He did not reply. Crosswaith then turned over the entire correspondence to George Schuler, then the New York editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, a black weekly newspaper. One of my points had been that Foster had been a native of Pittsburgh, and not a New Yorker or a resident of Harlem. Schuler, who had married a white Texan, was a man of impressive brilliance and imagination, His daughter Philippa was a genius and a recognized concert pianist. In the late 1920s, Schuller had published a bitterly satirical novel entitled Black No More. Described at one point as a black Mencken, he became progressively more conservative and was sometimes referred to as Harlem's Westbrook Pegler. It was even rumored that he was Harlem's only member of the John Birch Society. Schuller was fiercely loyal to Frank Crosswaith. One edition of the Pittsburgh Courier carried a headline shouting, "Harlem lawyer attacks Crosswaith." In an editorial, he then admonished me for what he called racial immaturity. He lived long enough to be distressed by seeing the Stephen Foster houses changed to the Malcolm X houses through the efforts of their black and Hispanic residents. If the racial atmosphere in America is ever to be improved, the blacks, who are called leaders, must offer genuine leadership. They cannot simply be the tools of the white establishment, for such leadership is ersatz and calculated to keep the anger of the blacks internal and tranquilized.
It is the kind of leadership that was paraded through the ghetto of Miami during a racial disturbance, using loudspeakers to tell the blacks to count their American blessings and to go home, and trust the very systems of justice that caused rioting in the first place. Such leadership obeys a directed policy but does not make policy. Genuine black leadership must be muscular and not swayed by those who would neutralize it into puppetry. It must address publicly and express exactly what most blacks really think and feel about white American society and why. Passive acceptance of racism merely fertilizes the roots of that oppression and aids its growth. But from the ranks of quiet, well-dressed lawyers come our judges of all colors. They are the respectable members of society who have accepted the American way of brutal death. The American way of life has touched exposed nerves by its racism, not only among blacks, but among Hispanics of color and Jews as well. The Jews, who are considered white, have built up through the years great and powerful blocs, such as B'nai B'rith and the Anti-Defamation League. Their publications are widely read, and their whiteness has allowed them to have white options and opportunities. Many have acquired great wealth. This is not to say that all Jews were always wealthy, or are wealthy today. I long ago read Michael Gold's Jews Without Money, and have known many Jews who have struggled through poverty. Nor did I have to read about Fortune's 500's greatest corporations to know that the wealth of America is primarily in the hands of the white Protestant establishment, which controls the banks, property, and government. The judiciary has been tainted by anti-Semitism, as well as by the racism that has color as its focus. The History of the American Bar by Charles Warren of the Boston Bar has an index that reads like the names in the purest Protestant social register, except for its inclusion of the name of Judah Benjamin. The Association of the Bar of New York, which passes judgment on those selected for the bench in New York City, refused to admit Jews for many years, and for even longer would not consider blacks. Jurisprudence in Action, however, published by the association in 1953, does not mention such discrimination. This aspect of the association is also ignored in Causes and Conflicts, the centennial history of that body, which dates from 1860. The suppression of black and Jewish membership in former years only exceeds the suppression of any mention of those scandals in a so-called learned profession. In 1949, New York, despite its large number of Jewish lawyers, had yet to have a surrogate who was Jewish. The Republicans nominated George Frankenthaler. He became the first Republican and the first member of the Jewish faith ever elected to the Surrogates Court since its creation in 1880. Louis Jaffe, of the Proskauer firm, had suggested that I work in that campaign, and I performed minor telephone functions for the Frankenthaler headquarters. There I was able to see the great volume of anti-Semitic mail that arrived daily. Most of it was anonymous, and it italicized some of the strong underground feelings against Jews. It seemed to make little difference that Frankenthaler was by far the best qualified of those contesting for the office. He won by only 1,150 votes. This anti-Semitism reflected a renaissance in local neo-Nazi thinking in New York. The fear and bias outstripped in their vituperation anything that I received during my years on the criminal court. Letters to me expressed a racist contempt, but no fear. The general theme was that I should go back to Africa and learn from the apes. One person enrolled me as a subscriber to every conceivable publication. This more impersonal annoyance resulted in my membership in book clubs, the large print New York Times for the blind, the National Association, various mutual funds, and the National Rifle Association. Calls came to my chambers daily in response to, quote-unquote, your inquiry about an eclectic catalog of merchandise, both practical and erotic. One dismayed resident of an East Side cooperative came to my chambers personally to leave a prospectus and an invitation for me to invade the restrictive covenants of Park Avenue's territorial imperative. That so many white judges are either unaware or insensitive to the degradations that are routine for blacks does not astonish me as much as it used to. What does cause concern is that self-appointed liberals and moderates often exhibit the same ignorance. My two oldest sons went through the ethical culture educational system and its Fieldston School in Riverdale. On one Father's Day at Fieldston, sitting next to Eli Wallach, I was amazed to see and hear the music instructors leading fathers and sons in a series of darky songs. It was my unhappy duty to interrupt that ethnic harmony with an objection that stopped the singing at least until I made my angry departure. When my oldest son was 5 years old, he came home one afternoon and began turning circles. Afraid that he might become dizzy and hurt himself, I asked him what he was doing. He replied, turning to butter. Furious because I recognized at once the little black Sambo source of that symbolism, I asked him where he had learned it. Predictably, he said that his teacher had not only read the story to his class, but had assigned roles for acting it out. When I protested the exposure of uncritical minds to what has become a racial stereotype, I was once again called a book burner. I was referred to the school's psychologist. In my anger, I told her that unless that book awaited a more mature and critical class of students, I would remove my son from the school. She said that my anger prevented a cool, rational, and analytical discussion of the problem, and that perhaps we should schedule another conference after she returned from a visit to New England, where she was going to see the changing colors of the leaves in autumn. I sought to assure her that she need not go so far as New England if it was color she was interested in. It became evident that it was going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to have a meaningful discussion with her. A problem of race and color seemed of less concern to her than her personal urgency to see the colors of autumn leaves in a distant place. The more I insisted that little black Sambo presented certain dangers for uncritical minds, the more she stressed the dangers of being called a book burner and a censor. She seemed to have no interest in the authorities on early education I cited and the documentation with which I supported my protest. She smiled tolerantly when I asked her to look at the materials I had assembled on the subject of how racist influence can taint young minds with harmful stereotypes, such as the Sambo illustrations. The interview was futile. I deteriorated into abuse. She seemed baffled when I asked her if her preoccupation with trees had ever allowed her to think about how many blacks had been lynched on her bearers of beautiful colors. She said that was hardly relevant to our discussion, which then ended abruptly. My worst fears were realized when my son, Jeff, then all of 4 years old, was referred to as Sambo by his closest little white friend at school. It seemed useless to revive further discussion with the psychologist simply to say to her, "I told you so." It is always difficult to persuade those who believe themselves to be liberals, as well as those middle-of-the-roaders who like to call themselves moderates, that all too often they may not live up to the hopeful adjectives they use to describe themselves. Such descriptions, of course, spring from the morality of self-interest and perhaps some degree of self-doubt. P.J. Sidney, an actor and a selfless activist, has long been an analyst of the little tragedies that give the human comedy so much depth. In particular, he detests those whites who piously but ambiguously describe themselves as moderates. To stress his contempt for what he called mugwumpery, he will always ask such confessors of their own status if they would wish their wives to be moderately virtuous. Of course, the danger in the universal application of such a question is that it might have to be altered just a bit depending upon the gender of the confessor. So-called moderate Americans are not always male, or if so, always married. Patriotic white studies are the foundation of America's educational experience, especially in history. White America expected blacks to be deliriously emotional about the bicentennial as anyone else, even though the only things blacks would rationally celebrate dating back to 200 years would be their miraculous survival of Christian bondage. Adopting George Washington as the father of my country would mean neglecting his Mount Vernon colony slaves. My white colleagues on the bench failed to understand my feelings about majority rule and my necessary exclusion from aspects of the American celebration. They refused to follow my assumptions, and yet these are the same reasoners who expect black urban peasants to stop and analyze the blessings of American apartheid before rioting in the streets or burning symbols of black oppression. What they also ignore is that the angry underclass that takes to the streets regards the black bourgeoisie as aloof elitists who serve as the dark agents of white oppression. In many ways, the destructive uprisings of poor blacks have resulted in the dwarf step progress enjoyed by those minorities with token symbols of advanced employment. There is a grassroots apprehension and understanding of reality, which makes ordinary people of the streets wary of blacks who are placed in certain positions. John Sandifer was at one time the black deputy assistant administrative judge in charge of the criminal branches of the Supreme Court and of the criminal courts in New York City. He is regarded with bitter suspicion by minorities who look at the criminal justice system. It is suspected that he was placed in his position to show how liberal the system is. In keeping the system functioning, he became just another one of the judges supervising the warehousing of as many blacks and Hispanics as possible. His role in having me transferred from the criminal to the civil court in 1974 as a disciplinary measure to appease the police has been described as highly suspect. When I was returned to the criminal court in 1978, it is believed to have been a gesture to avoid embarrassing examinations before the trial of Sandifer and Charles Brightel, then Chief Judge of New York's Court of Appeals. My federal lawsuit against the administrative judges and others was then pending, and earlier depositions had revealed some strange inconsistencies in the various official versions of my precipitate transfer. The small number of black judges have found it an advantage to their outward state of aloof serenity not to jeopardize their membership in the Society of Judges. To be outspoken and critical is to risk nettlesome assignments and to forego any opportunity for promotion. A black criminal court judge does well to heed Mayor Koch's warning that those who do not reflect by their conduct his own inflexible attitudes toward judging need not expect reappointment. Accused of racism because of his notable lack of enthusiasm for black appointments, Koch has little fear of black reaction. Blacks do not vote in great numbers and are thus regarded as political eunuchs. Even judges who will not risk saying so publicly would like to see themselves as members of an independent judiciary. Privately, they express resentment of a mayor who wishes them to pay strict allegiance to his whim and his own purely political and opportunist view of justice. They do not wish to be puppets for such a mayor's expedient ventriloquism, and yet, by not making a public outcry, they become the very puppets they wish to condemn. I would like to see the training of potential judges begin at the college level, before anyone could become eligible for law school. Whether or not he or she wished to opt for the ambition of judging, each should be required to study some of the more suppressed aspects of American history, including the terror and subjugation and bending of the spirit in modern society caused by black slavery under the Constitution. The curriculum would include a study of the role of the law in making slavery legal for so long and the influence of such bondage in shaping the attitudes of blacks and their limited participation in American life. Such students, whether white or black or other, will be exposed to an analysis of the peculiar sociology of inner city and urban existence, and the conspiracies of reality, overt or otherwise, that have restricted and limited black ambition and options. Coupled with such studies would be emphasis on black heroes in history, black American patriots, black inventors, and black family life, about which students in particular are woefully ignorant. Many blacks as well as whites have no knowledge whatsoever of these things. They too should learn. No person called upon to judge the residents of a society so long scorned and held up to contempt because of color stereotypes deeply ingrained in American thinking and emotions should dare come to the bench as ignorant of the black circumstance as most now are. Absent such instruction, blacks and other aliens to America's society become no more than detested grist for the country's judicial mills. Such an education might well be revealing and beneficial. It would at least be a significant departure from the white studies and historical platitudes that allow students to see no warts on America's white figures and no significant black individuals at all. Absent such teaching, typical American education at all levels becomes no more than a perpetuation of a class system that the Constitution's libertarian language denies as a matter of practice in theory only. In a society shriven of black bondage, the residual trappings of such an antebellum culture should also be rooted out. That can never happen in America as long as law students are taught merely the techniques of analyzing the complex facts of commercial situations. The current tradition is to teach them tactics and ways to effect legislation which will not jeopardize the institutions they hope to join as perpetuators of policy. Such political inbreeding does not bring about social change that would dramatize the Constitution's meaning of even-handed justice for all, no matter what a citizen's skin color. Such instruction has been called sociological jurisprudence by Roscoe Pound, once the dean of the Harvard Law School. That theory would seek to make lawyers and judges more than impersonal calculators summing up the historical bias of the society in which they are aloof agents. Pound, more than any other scholar of the law, sought to emphasize humane realism and the incorporation of social studies into the law school curriculum. He recognized the powerful influence of law and lawyers in society and their role in national and local government. The law, he thought, could be the promissory device for achieving social reconstruction in American life. Pound urged a movement that would put the human factor in a central place and would reject the emotional logic of the past, the agrarian and evangelical confusions that made so many accept both their God and the enslavement of others at the same time. He seemed to differ sharply with Oliver Wendell Holmes, who did not like the idea of experimenting with the 14th Amendment. And yet, it was precisely that amendment which called for a national experiment. It was indeed a radical concept to provide equal protection of the laws for the emancipated blacks who had only recently been adopted as citizens and persons. The 14th Amendment had become an instrument for social engineering, although, as it developed, a much neglected one in confirming the privileges and immunities of black citizens. No judge who presides over the tensions and the violence of alienation and condemnation should ever dare to sit in judgment of those dark strangers to his or her way of life. Ironically, in terms of the teachings of history, an American judge can feel that he has more in common with a white Russian than with a black American. As society swings into an era of rightist conservatism, it becomes less and less likely that the law will lead to social experimentation, either under the 14th Amendment or otherwise. Neither does the American mood seem receptive to the proposed Equal Rights Amendment to promote the interests of women, whose plight is so often identified with that of blacks in American society. When Pablo Neruda addressed the PEN Club after he had won his Nobel Prize, he said that the blacks are the luckless race. He could have added that women are the luckless sex. The occasional weekend retreats, now provided for judges by the Office of Court Administration, do not engage the hard questions that burden the everyday business of criminal courts in cities with large black and Hispanic populations. Thus far, many writers on the subject of racial discrimination in the courts have done no more than deplore what exists. Former federal judge Marvin Frankel has written an extremely useful little book called Criminal Sentences. He subtitles it Law Without Order. Frankel notes the great disparity between sentences imposed on blacks and the poor as compared with those for identical crimes imposed on whites. And even when the crimes are not the same, there are remarkable distinctions. Irving Ben Cooper is a federal judge in New York whose confirmation by the Senate was fraught with controversy. Competing views were expressed concerning his emotional stability. He was the chief judge of the Court of Special Sessions when I asked that Judge George Carney be removed because of his expressed views about a colored woman. In January 1980, I appeared in his court to move the admission of John Sheehan as a member of the federal bar. It appeared that Judge Cooper had lost his notes. While a large number of lawyers waited to have their admissions moved, he seemed to be searching among the papers on the bench, talking all the while. Among the young lawyers awaiting admission were several Asians. Judge Cooper selected that occasion to tell a Chinese accent joke. Earlier in his career on the federal bench, Cooper had been called upon to sentence two defendants, one white, one black. The white defendant was a former Wall Street broker. He had been convicted of illegally selling stocks. He had collected a commission of some $250,000, which he laundered through a secret Swiss bank account. He had perjured himself before the federal grand jury that investigated him. Judge Cooper remarked that the well-dressed defendant was not likely to repeat such an act. He fined him some $90,000 and placed him on probation for a year. Simple subtraction may reveal that, in that case at least, crime did pay. When Judge Cooper sentenced the black man, however, prison was on his mind. The black man, the sole supporter of a diabetic wife and daughter, was a truck driver. He had been convicted of stealing a television set from the truck he drove. It was a black and white set worth less than $100. The judge sent him to jail for a year. The act may have been society's vengeance, but it was also society's folly. The black man's wife became a ward of welfare. One can only speculate on the problems the husband has had since his release while seeking employment. And so, the improvement of the criminal justice system, quite apart from its racism, should appeal to those who perceive how the taxpayers' money is wasted in some instances. As for improving the quality of justice in the criminal courts, again, that depends upon the judges and their understanding. This, as noted, is a matter of preparation. Until society is prepared to educate its judges before they ascend the bench, little change in the system can be expected. This means that, to a large extent, racism will continue unabated. Little else can be expected in a country still torn by school desegregation lawsuits, employment problems, and bitter and angry challenges to what used to be called affirmative action. Also continued will be the repressive quotas reserved for blacks in all areas of life, quotas of limitation, which majority rule seems not to oppose. The opinion held of Lyndon B. Johnson by those who shaped the nation's attitudes and thoughts does not appear flattering. He was perceived as Machiavellian, given to political duplicity and maneuvering. Nevertheless, he was more useful to the cause of blacks in America than any other president. His unprecedented linking of arms with blacks on the campus at Howard University while singing "We Shall Overcome" was a gesture of incredible goodwill from the White House for the black struggle. It is such emotional involvement that offers comfort to black citizens of the United States. Johnson was the only president to display such a public identification with black ambition for survival. His was the first acknowledgement from the fountainhead of American power that blacks and whites enjoyed national kinship. It gave blacks all over the country a tremendous emotional boost. I doubt that it did anything to abate black crime, however. The nomadic black and urban peasants who wander the streets engaging in crimes which they believe aid their survival seldom read of presidential news conferences or executive signings. For those of us who relish the idea of a president suggesting in lyrics that the dark underclass should overcome, it was incredible. It seems doubtful that such a romantic gesture will ever be repeated. Certainly, President Ronald Reagan's attitudes point in the opposite direction from interracial goodwill. The brief Johnson era of good feeling is all but forgotten now. It is a nostalgic footnote to a time that has disappeared, swallowed up by another and different era. Society remembers the murders, the rapes, the robberies, and the muggings attributed to blacks. Few recall that some 15 black children disappeared in Atlanta and that now and then a corpse was discovered. No headlines blaze across the front pages of the tabloids, however, when blacks are discovered to be murdered with their hearts cut out. This symbol of racial hate becomes intensified when it is remembered how complicated and time-consuming it is for expert surgeons to cut a human heart out. The bone of the sternum must be sawed through. The heart is protected behind the rib cage and the depths of the upper body. That racial hate is able to compel one to such lengths is a source of wonderment. It makes one ask if there is anything in America that will cure the wound of race, whether it be a university that trains citizens to be judges or some other remedy. Alexis de Tocqueville visited America in the 1830s to see how democracy was faring in the then new republic. He remarked that the bench and the bar were America's nobility, although he mentioned that Americans were willing to sue over any conceivable injustice. He did not explore theories of justice. The law, not justice, is emphasized. Law and order were the twin cries of Adolf Hitler at one time. Hitler's final solution for the Jews proved, if any proof was needed, that all too often law has little or nothing to do with justice. And law and order is the cry heard throughout America today. Politicians win elections by standing in the jailhouse door in their commercials, promising that that is where they will excommunicate all criminals. The more the politicians threaten to stop crime and imprison criminals, the more crime we have. The newspapers never fail to describe a black defendant as such. Seldom, if ever, is a white defendant so described. Given the prevailing climate of thought or reaction on the subject, most people will assume one charged with a crime is black. None of this should be read as a defense of black criminals or their crimes. What to do about crime and criminals is the imponderable that confronts both me and the system. It is clear that prisons have not provided a satisfactory answer, nor have learned criminologists. Why have the prisons become so disproportionately black and Hispanic in the last few years? Why is their population composed of the poor? Some will say that society in the land of plenty is hostile to poverty and those who suffer from that affliction. Amateur analysts may therefore theorize that the poor act out their hostility to the haves through larcenies, some of which are violent and fatal. Obviously, there is a criminal class. Too often, to be accidental, the criminal class is a class within a class, for most who are caught and convicted belong to that underclass known as the poor. It may sound like a cliche, but it seems that society manufactures both the poor and its criminal element. That shabby deception we know as the low-rent housing project has long been a breeding ground for crime. Sometimes crime is the only way the poor can get even with society for the housing it so grudgingly extends to them. The absence of common amenities, such as closet doors, in modern high-rise projects is common. Even cold winter flats and old law tenements had doors on their closets. The constant presence of police officers in housing projects gives the poor the impression that they are being carefully watched, the way keepers in a zoo watch dangerous animals. Thus, when captured from such an environment, defendants who are poor find little difference between the jails and their homes. Indeed, poor prisoners in jail sometimes have beds all to themselves for the first time in their lives. For 10 years in the criminal court, I watched the parade of the poor. It was my duty, I felt, to see that for once at least they received a fair deal, and that those whites who stood before the bar got a quantity of justice no different from that received by blacks and Hispanics. To that extent, the element of race interfered with my own judgment. But to the extent that I considered race, it was to make certain that neither white nor black skin would be discriminated against in my court. I believed that the purpose of justice, among other things, was to do everything possible to make certain that a criminal defendant did not become a recidivist. Clearly, I have been a failure. The latest statistics reveal that most of those arrested, tried, and convicted have been repeaters and persistently involved in careers of crime. We should have learned by now that locking them up and throwing the key away is not the answer. We may throw the key away, but there is always a parole board that by law must review sentences after a specific period of time has been served. In its discretion, it can say that defendants are ready to be released into society, irrespective of the loudly proclaimed Rockefeller narcotics law, which threatened to keep drug offenders in prison for life. What this means is that an offender sentenced to life may serve from 1 to more years, but will eventually be discharged from prison. The life sentence means only that when released, a defendant will be under the eye of a parole officer for the remainder of his life. But he will be out on the streets and not behind bars. So fearful and alarmed has the populace become that at the process of arraignment, when a defendant is merely charged with a crime, society lusts for his blood and applauds his capture only if bail is set at an impossible and inflationary figure. They cheer the violation of the very Constitution which they say is endangered by the felons. Most authorities who take the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution seriously agree that when the amendment says bail shall not be excessive, it means that it must be reasonable. What is reasonable for a person who has $2? All too often, the judges are concerned about a public reaction to what they do. These are the same judges who instruct a jury to disregard what public reaction may be to a verdict and not to be concerned about whether it will be popular or unpopular. Realizing that Toryism has seized the land, a judge will not risk press and public excoriation and will fix bail at a figure guaranteed to satisfy a public mood and keep the defendant in prison before he is convicted of anything. Given that the largest number of criminal defendants are from our inner cities and black, bail becomes an instrument of social repression. In such cases, the presumption of innocence is abandoned, and the judge has done what he believes the anxious public would have done had it been the judge. Thus, judging becomes abandoned to the public, and judicial discretion becomes whatever a judge perceives a community emotion to demand. Worse, it sometimes becomes what he believes would not offend the media. The hard fact is that none of us knows what to do about crime, other than hope that our persons in our homes will be secure. But in our desperation to do something, we send offenders to jail. Judges, divorced from the way of life of the streets, hear a catalog of crimes read off and charged to the defendant. They are appalled. It is not their way of life. They are shocked. They become angry. They realize that they are really a sedate security force and keepers of the peace that has been lost. In their minds, they convict the defendant. He becomes the embodiment of the accusations against him, a grave menace and danger to society. Some judges may think of Edwin Markham's The Man with the Hoe and wonder, who loosed and let down that brutal jaw? It is then that the judge comes to believe that there really is a criminal class of predators whose only mission is to prey upon both the wary and the unwary. Their language is different from that of the judicial class. They mumble out their pleas. They try to manipulate the system that has already manipulated them. They become actors in what they regard as a theater of the absurd. They put on false faces of either humility or defiance. Their very postures dissemble. They are embarrassed not because of their public exposure, but because they have failed in their craft, and sometimes they are simply angry for being falsely accused. But for those who are as guilty as politicians trapped on videotape, Their failure to defeat detection becomes the ultimate offense against themselves. Somehow, those of us who sit in judgment suspect that the defendants are plotting to do better when they get out. That is, better at avoiding the respectable traps laid for them by society. And so, as with the juror mentioned earlier, we believe that we should just put them away for a good long while. Then there is the matter of recidivism. That prisoners should plot their vengeance is not surprising. The custody that is given to inspire penitence and atonement can often be brutal and inhumane. Most of New York's large prisons are in the upstate rural hinterlands. The chief industry of those areas, such as Attica, Clinton, Dannemora, and Greenhaven, is custody. The deprivation of family and affectionate touching does not breed kindliness or gentility. After years of such a hostile siege, society discharges its prisoners back to the streets from which they were captured. What have they learned in prison that fits them for a role as a model citizen? If it's making license plates, there's only one place they are made. If it is learning how to share a cell with another captive, that's not what participation in society is all about. Discharged prisoners are expected to find a job, but doing what? Where? With communities seized by fear of crime? They do not gladly welcome ex-convicts. There are a few federal prisons that have no walls, but do have libraries, tennis courts, swimming pools, saunas, and other amenities generally associated with private country clubs. Many of the Watergate offenders seem to have prospered there, if not in morality, then in literature and post-release affluence. Their crimes were not violent, they were not armed intruders, and they were not poor or illiterate. In some respects, their prisons became university clubs, and yet, measured on a scale of civics and loyalty, their crimes were frightening, for they reflected betrayal of a national trust, disloyalty, and a corruption of the government they were sworn to uphold and defend. Such betrayals have the odor of treason and treachery. Philosophically, at least, such crimes are much more serious than random larcenies and burglaries. The poor can always rationalize a theft, citing need. Other than misconceived power, the Watergate offenders, well educated, well spoken, well dressed, well housed, could not justify their deeds. Punishment without pity, urged President Nixon as he pressed for wholesale revision of criminal law codes, and yet, was it not pity that resulted in his pardon? Or was it simply the rule of the inner circle and clubbiness? Clearly there was no punishment without pity for those sent off to the genteel and comfortable prisons. It is possible to regard such sojourns as no punishment at all, and now all are successfully rehabilitated. Nixon is much honored and shamelessly received his presidential pension, his free office space in a federal office building, a staff and Secret Service protection, and it would be surprising if the deed to his luxurious New Jersey estate differed largely from the covenants in those of William Rehnquist. Poor minority prisoners, and white ones as well, are aware of such goings-on. They saw Vice President Agnew plead no contest to charges that he plotted some of his offenses in his White House office. He arrived at court in a chauffeur-driven limousine. He took his rap on the wrist and departed as he had arrived, in style. He is now a success in business, and an author as well. He never served time in prison. Can it be said that a betrayal of a national trust and confidence is more tolerantly regarded than robbery or burglary, because there is no violence or threat? Are we kinder to our embezzlers and frauds because secretly we hope they get away with their crimes and live to enjoy their fruits, perhaps on a tropical isle somewhere, since we would love to do the same thing? From the disparity in regarding different kinds of crime to the disparity in sentencing is but a short step, and kindness to one as opposed to the other is a matter of belonging to the club. The robber barons of the late 1800s and others verified their respectability by creating foundations, giving back to society a portion of what had been taken, with white-collar calculation and tax benefits. Such a ploy is unavailable to the common thief. The Watergate criminals appear to have found much prosperity in writing books and in appearances on television talk shows. None is a quote-unquote how-to volume, and some purport to be fiction. None of these men is known to have created a foundation to support a worthy charitable cause. All seem to have come by their financial rewards before the laws were passed that deprive criminal offenders of profit from their victims and divert such proceeds to the families of the victims. The poor, then, are a useless underclass in the nation, and it is the poor who populate our prisons with a long-term presence. Very few rich people go to jail. Even fewer of the wealthy are executed. Some analysts believe it is because those of means can afford the best lawyers in the land. Certainly, they can afford bail and are free to consult and work with their lawyers and prepare their cases. If rehabilitation is ever to be more than a word, it is something that must be tried with poor prisoners. Let them have swimming pools, saunas, and prisons without walls. They have no money to flee to distant, unaligned islands, or simply escape and risk confinement in a traditional prison. While they are there, in middle-class vacation comforts, train them for something practical as computer programmers, key punch operators, or workers in some other branch of the world according to high tech. Clearly they would not have something they were accustomed to, even with ill-gotten gains. Tennis and saunas would be priorities with poor larceners. They might just want to strike honestly for life once freed. Unless, of course, rehabilitation is to be officially neglected, much now needs to be done in restructuring our entire concept of prisons. Since infractions of any kind result in intramural sentences ranging from a deprivation of rights to solitary confinement, each prisoner should be handed a printed set of the institution's rules of conduct upon entering. This might be his first lesson in conducting himself in a managed society. Often prisoners complain that they are punished for breaking rules they never knew existed. None of this is soft on crime. It is merely offering offenders a chance to become used to, aid, receptive to community conduct standards, a routine they must follow outside the walls if they are not to be captured again. Prison guards, like judges and police, must learn more than the bare essentials necessary to pass a civil service examination. They are host to the dissidents, malcontents, and resistors of the system that jailed them. Their guests were not invited. They were sent. Under most circumstances, they may be expected to be as bitter as crewmen shanghaied aboard an ancient sailing ship. If the letters I received define a mood, it is that the imprisoned writers believe they never had a fair trial and that none was even possible. Within the walls themselves, fairness is an urgency. If all that can be done to prevent recidivism is done in prison, those who leave that environment are not so dehumanized that their standards for survival are bluntly at odds with those of society on the outside. While halfway houses are geared to aid in the transition between prison and freedom, 10 years of prison life, if spent in inhumane conditions, cannot be undone in a matter of months. The humanitarian aspect must be practiced inside the prison, for the hungers that ferment in a dehumanized setting lead straight back to prison. If this humanization is to be tried in major prisons, as it has been in specific federal ones, it means re-education of personnel as well as prisoners themselves. In New York, for example, although the prisons are in remote rural areas, most of the prisoners come from the cities. The vast majority of the custodial personnel are local people to whom custody of strangers is the principal industry. If the humanization experiment is to work, the prison guards as well as their supervisors need some education concerning the kind of background from which their prisoners come, including the way of life in ethnic ghettos and barrios, the historical and other factors that led to prison. It seems strange that those who have betrayed the public trust by conduct in the nation's capital should be trusted with the comforts of luxury, not unlike their usual environment, when the poor are exposed to just the opposite, not unlike the usual circumstances that bred their way of life. To have that way of life reinforced year after year in a prison only hardens them the more, giving them no preparation for life after release. That it is a rude and harsh life is beyond doubt. One of the wardens of a federal country club type prison said he had no fear that his wards would simply walk out and escape. They knew that escape would mean recapture and commitment to a real prison. The vast majority of prisons that exist today do little more than increase the senses of an ever-increasing hostile underclass, channeled periodically back among, not into, society. Sometimes that underclass rebels within the walls, and we read of prisoners taking their guards hostage and making demands in the name of humane conditions. Resolutions of such confrontations has settled little except particular local crises, when a more universal and sweeping change in conditions is needed. Such tragedies all too often overwhelm the actors and those who are held as symbols of what the prisoners regard as their oppression. The so-called Attica massacre is one result. There, the then governor of New York simply decided to use raw power and go in with guns blazing. The very people who, in theory at least, were to be rescued were cut down as savagely as were the prisoners. One of the persons who prosecuted charges against the rebels has reassessed his own role in some of the things that resulted in the angry protest and its bloody conclusion. His book is entitled Turkey Shoot. While that foray by the authorities with armed might may have won applause from holier-than-thou conservatives, it did nothing to change prisons. Prison reforms are a touchy subject. Too many people have been victimized by crime, one way or another. The public feeling is one of fear. The politician, mayor, governor, or legislator who urges changes is likely to forfeit the prize of his office. He will be accused of being a weeping sympathizer with criminals, a bleeding heart, and soft-headed. In responding to such fears, neither the public nor the legislators appear to see that they are aiding and abetting a system that does nothing more than perpetuate the errors of old. When Benjamin Ward was New York's correction commissioner, he was brave enough to introduce contact visits between married prisoners and their spouses. This at least allowed prisoners some semblance of family, some appreciation for the humanity they could look forward to. Late on weekend nights at Columbus Circle in Manhattan, buses of all sizes and kind, as well as small vans, line up, and wives, children, and parents of prisoners assemble to start the 8-hour trips upstate to visit. They appear to be 99% black or Hispanic, reflecting the prison population itself. To witness such an example of family love and loyalty makes it the more astonishing that criminals could come from such an affectionate background. It confirms also how many people believe firmly that the system has been unfair and unjust. Prisoners themselves find time to issue petitions and briefs in their own cause, expressing doubts about their lawyers, assigned and otherwise. Some focus upon technicalities that might, at best, give them a new trial. Others, and there are many, deny that they are guilty at all. One of the most remarkable things one notices from such protests is how literate former school dropouts have become in prison. They cite and distinguish leading cases, advance theories, and press writs. They appear to have learned in prison many of the disciplines they rejected when at liberty. There is some hope to be found in the fact that several universities have brought programs within the walls. where regular instruction can be had and some degrees won. It would be helpful to know what records the prisons keep of its college graduates and how the graduates have fared once out. One way to bring about change would seem to be having realistic training programs for those sentenced to a period of years. First, wardens and their staff would have to discover what skills industry requires most often. Every day, for example, in classified newspaper ads, there are literally hundreds of jobs that seek qualified applicants. After research into what is needed, for example, high-tech experts are much in demand, programs could be organized around need. Then, of course, the authorities would have to persuade industry to employ ex-convicts. It is a mammoth job, of course. If ever anything is to be done, both on the practical and experimental side, a start must be made. To do nothing is, in effect, to welcome back into the same society that bred them the former prisoners who have no prospects and only the suspicion and scorn of the public. The only recourse they have is, again, to crime, or to the public's deprivation and the taxpayer's expense. The prominent place such attitudes hold in the judicial mind can often generate bitter hostility. In 1972, the New York City community and neighborhood lawyers representing the poor sued, seeking to have the appellate judges admonish those in the lower trial courts not to vent their hostility against the poor or against the lawyers who defended them. Such admonitions, however, seldom undo the class antagonism frequently generated among black-robed guardians of their society's morals. When the defendant is black, all too often the judge sees before him a member of what is regarded as a non-literate society, an enemy of the judge's own society, and perhaps a potential personal enemy. With the power to punish at hand, the judges deem that such aliens to their way of life must be banished. It is as though there is no hope for the black, no deserved consequence other than durance vile. The enmity reserved for the poor becomes intensified when poverty is also black. It is then that Shaw's words from the preface to Major Barber come alive. One can understand how, quote, the greatest evils and the worst of crimes is poverty, end quote. One is allowed to speculate why so many blacks and Hispanics are held in prison. The latest tabulation shows that more than 55% of the prisoners are black and some 13% are Hispanic. This probably does not take into consideration some Hispanics whose criminal records say they are quote-unquote white. One District of Columbia judge, anxious to see the places of confinement where he sent defendants, visited several jails. He was astonished, he said, because the vast majority of the prisoners were black. He said he remembered seeing numbers of whites charged with crime, and he wondered whatever happened to them because so few were detained. It was as though society feared the black offender more than the white one and had devised different concept of punishment for each. It is facile to say that poverty provides fertile inspiration for crime, even when the crimes are violent and appear to have little or no connection with economic need or profit. And yet, what other explanation is available to reason, unless it be assumed that there is an underclass among us thriving on its bloodlust? Anthropologically, I suppose, it might be said that the divisions in our society as a whole invite the exploitation of one class by the other, and that it has always been that way. There have always been kings, no matter what they were called. They justify the fealty they demand by suggesting that reciprocity sustains the class arrangement. The kings protect and the other classes serve. Maintaining such social divisions in some degree of harmony preserves the system. Those who offend such a plan are seen as disrupting the harmony, and they must be punished exemplary harshness to preserve the harmony and thus the system itself, with its advantages resting securely with one group and the disadvantages and lack of benefits imposed on the other. It is not suggested that poor blacks analyze such a system of benefits and deprivations intellectually and decide that criminal revolution is the only way, but they must feel it. They know something has failed. They break a social contract that was not of their making in the first place. There is, in fact, nothing else for them to do. The desperation of poverty, powerlessness, and hopelessness can induce a despairing recklessness that leads one to say, in effect, "What have I got to lose?" Nothing, of course, and if not caught, there can be great and tax-free profit. In such situations of tension and conflict, the morality of self-interest triumphs over any purely philosophical theory of morals, and the morality of the poor becomes distinctly different from the comfortable morality of the haves. In microcosm, we then have a breached social contract and individual revolutions against the system. Success in crime becomes the criminal's private coup d'etat, his momentary victory. Naturally, social relationships are not supposed to be this way in a moral society. On the other hand, the poor doubtless believe that society should not be the way it is to them. Whatever has been done about crime in the past has been unavailing. Idealists continue to attend conferences, seminars, preceptorials, and research conventions on what to do about crime. It has become a persistent mystery and one of civilization's inexplicable vexations, and so we plunge blindly on, perpetuating a system of both crime and outmoded forms of punishment. It takes time to analyze the social process involved in law and order and in the haves and the have-nots. Investment in such speculative hopefulness is unpopular. It is simply not the popular will, nor is the abatement of racism in America the popular will. If anything, there are little signs now and then that racism is encouraged. The New York Times for June 28, 1985 reported that a judge in Kentucky awarded workers' compensation to a white man based on the latter's, quote, "fear of working with black people," end quote. The 39-year-old beneficiary of this largesse was said by a psychiatrist to suffer from paranoid schizophrenia. Such a precedent may open a door that might bankrupt workers' compensation funds. It is almost as though the civil rights movement, with its passing era of goodwill and good feeling, has been reassessed as a national mistake. Those who signed the quote-unquote Southern Manifesto have their emotional successors in Congress, and they seem to know the mood of the country as efforts proceed apace to undo some of the civil rights victories of the 1960s. At least, many view the Reagan administration as leading the way in such an about-face march. I remain convinced that so long as Americans can see the darkness of skin color, just so long will they feel that discriminations based upon that distinction are perfectly natural and not immoral. Indeed, such discriminations are very American, representing a kind of genetically implanted view that is inseparable from American history. The national preference for white skin may define a problem that is beyond solution, absent a nation of the blind. Too many of our institutions are based on exclusion of some from the blessings and benefits of our systems and its society. This creates a sub-society that must take what it wants, alas. For some of us, theories of justice will occupy our sense of inquiry forever. Perhaps, as in the field of pure science, some ultimate discovery will be made by accident for the disease-like irritation of both crime and racism. And perhaps, just perhaps, such a discovery will promote justice as fairness, a fairness from which the taint of democracy's racism will be absent. End of Black Robes, White Justice by Bruce Wright.